I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw the engagement announcement. My sister Emily was getting married and I hadn't been told. Not a call, not a text, nothing. When I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother why I wasn't invited, her answer was ice cold. "You'd only ruin it, Nicole. This wedding is for real family." Real family. As if 36 years of being their scapegoat hadn't already taught me I was disposable. That's when something inside me snapped. Not with rage, but with clarity. For decades I'd stayed silent while they erased me, blamed me, used me. But this time I had something they didn't know about. Evidence. Recordings. Secrets that could detonate their perfect facade like a bomb. So I made a choice. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at their table anymore. I was going to flip the entire table over. 3 months later, the wedding day arrived. I stayed home watching the live stream from my apartment. Everything looked perfect. The flowers, the champagne, my mother's triumphant smile as she took the microphone to toast the happy couple. Then the groom stood up, and what happened next would be viewed 20 million times in 48 hours. Because when that video of him confronting my mother went viral, when the world saw her fall, saw the truth explode in front of 200 guests, everyone finally understood what I'd known my whole life. My family's perfection was a lie, and I had just exposed every single crack. This is the story of how I went from the daughter they banned to the woman who brought their empire crashing down. And trust me, you won't believe where this ends. My name is Nicole Grant. I'm 36 years old, a freelance graphic designer living in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. And for most of my life, I've been very good at being invisible. It's a skill you develop when your family treats you like a stain they're constantly trying to scrub away. I learned early that the less space I took up, the less ammunition they had against me. But on that cold Sunday morning in January, scrolling through Facebook with my coffee growing cold beside me, I discovered that I hadn't just been made invisible, I'd been completely erased. The post appeared in my feed like a knife slipping between ribs. It was from Patricia Holloway, one of those peripheral family acquaintances who exists on the edges of my parents' social circle in Connecticut. The kind of woman who wears pearls to brunch and measures her worth in country club memberships. Her post was enthusiastic, dripping with exclamation points. "Congratulations to Emily Grant on her engagement to Ethan Wallace. What a beautiful celebration at the Grant estate last night. So happy for this lovely family." The photos loaded slowly on my phone, each one a small detonation. There was my sister Emily, 28, and radiant in a designer dress I didn't recognize, holding up her left hand to show off a diamond that probably cost more than my annual rent. There was my mother, Marjorie Grant, elegant in champagne silk, her arm draped possessively around Emily's shoulders, smiling that practiced smile she reserves for public consumption. My father, Richard, stood slightly apart, as always, holding a glass of what I knew would be expensive scotch, his expression carefully neutral. Behind them, the familiar backdrop of my childhood home, the estate in Greenwich where I grew up but never truly belonged. I scrolled through image after image, tables set with elaborate floral arrangements, a cake with multiple tiers, champagne glasses catching the light, happy faces of people I recognized from various family gatherings over the years, all of them celebrating this milestone, this joyous occasion. And I knew none of it. Emily was engaged. There had been a party. My entire family had gathered to toast her future, and no one had told me. My hands started to shake. The phone felt suddenly heavy, like it was made of lead instead of glass and plastic. This wasn't like being excluded from a casual dinner or a holiday gathering. This was my sister's engagement. This was the kind of event that in a normal family would warrant at least a phone call. Even if they didn't want me there, and the message had been clear for years that they rarely did the courtesy of informing me should have been automatic. Unless, of course, the exclusion itself was the point. I sat there for what might have been 10 minutes or an hour, my coffee forgotten, my Sunday morning work deadline fading into irrelevance. The familiar ache settled into my chest, that old companion I'd carried since childhood. But this time it felt different. Sharper. more final. This wasn't just another slight, another casual cruelty. This was a declaration. They had thrown a party, invited their entire social circle, documented it on social media for the world to see, and deliberately kept it from me. I hadn't been overlooked. I'd been erased. I knew I shouldn't call. Nothing good ever came from confronting my mother when she'd already decided on a narrative. But my fingers dialed her number anyway, some desperate part of me still hoping for an explanation that would make sense, that would hurt less. She answered on the third ring, her voice crisp and composed. "Nicole, this is unexpected." "I saw the photos on Facebook," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. "Emily's engaged." There was a pause, the kind of calculated silence my mother wielded like a weapon. "Yes, Ethan Wallace, lovely young man. The engagement party was last night." I wasn't invited. No. Just that. No apology, no explanation. Just acknowledgement of the fact. Why? The question came out smaller than I intended, and I hated myself for it. Marjorie sighed, the sound of someone being forced to explain something obvious to a slow child. "Nicole, you know how you are at these events. You always bring a certain tension. Emily's engagement is a delicate time. We need to maintain appearances, and frankly, it's easier when you're not there creating complications." The words hit exactly where she intended them. I heard my father's voice in the background, muffled, saying something I couldn't make out. He didn't come to the phone. He never did. "Complications," I repeated. "Don't be dramatic. This isn't about you. It's about Emily and her future. Surely you can understand that we want this to be perfect for her. The wedding is in 3 months and there's so much to coordinate. We're trying to keep things simple." Simple. That was the word that did it. Simple meant without me. Simple meant their perfect family tableau didn't include the daughter who never quite fit, who asked uncomfortable questions, who reminded them of whatever sins they'd committed that resulted in my existence. I'd spent 36 years trying to decode why I was the one who didn't belong, and in that moment listening to my mother's cold voice, explaining why my absence made their lives easier, I finally understood. It wasn't about anything I'd done. It was about who I was, or more accurately, who they'd decided I was. "I understand," I said quietly, and I did. I understood that I would never be enough for them. I understood that I could spend the rest of my life trying to earn a place at their table and never succeed. I understood that to them, I was expendable. I hung up without saying goodbye. My mother wouldn't care. She'd probably already moved on to the next item on her agenda. The inconvenient conversation with her problematic daughter checked off her mental list. I sat in my small apartment surrounded by the life I'd built with no help from them, and I didn't cry. I'd learned long ago that tears were wasted on people who didn't care about your pain. Instead, I opened my journal, a leather-bound book I'd kept since college, filled with entries I never let anyone read. My therapist called it processing. I called it survival. I wrote, "They didn't invite me. I don't know why I'm surprised." But I was surprised. Despite everything, despite years of being the family scapegoat, of being blamed for things I didn't do, of watching Emily be praised for the same behaviors I was punished for, some stupid part of me still expected basic human decency from them. That part of me had just died. I spent the rest of Sunday working on a client's logo design, throwing myself into the familiar comfort of Photoshop and color theory. Anything to avoid thinking about that party. Those photos that smile on my mother's face as she posed with the daughter she actually loved. Tuesday morning, I found the envelope in my mailbox. Thick cream paper, expensive stock, my name and address printed in formal calligraphy. For a moment, my heart did something complicated, a leap and a sink at the same time. I carried it upstairs, set it on my kitchen counter, and stared at it for a full 5 minutes before opening it. The invitation was everything you'd expect from a Grant family wedding. Embossed lettering, formal wording. Emily Grant and Ethan Wallace request the honor of your presence. April 20th. The Greenwich Estate. Black tie optional. It was beautiful and impersonal, the kind of invitation that gets sent to 200 people who barely know the bride. There was no personal note on the main card, nothing to indicate I was anything other than a name on a mailing list. But when I picked up the envelope to throw it away, a small piece of paper fluttered out. A note card. The handwriting unmistakable, Emily's looping script that our mother had spent thousands of dollars on calligraphy lessons to perfect. I'm sorry. 2 words. Nothing more. No explanation. No context. Just an apology that raised more questions than it answered. Was she sorry I wasn't invited to the engagement party? Sorry about the wedding? Sorry for our entire childhood, where she'd stood by and watched our mother destroy me piece by piece? Or was this just Emily's way of maintaining her own innocence? A token gesture that cost her nothing, but made her feel better about her complicity. I held that note for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. For 36 years, I'd played by their rules. I'd stayed quiet when accused of things I didn't do. I'd absorbed their blame, their coldness, their casual cruelties. I'd built a life separate from them and told myself that distance was the same as healing. I'd convinced myself that being the bigger person meant accepting their treatment without protest. But staring at Emily's apology, so small, so insufficient, so safe, something in me cracked open. Not with rage, but with clarity. What if I didn't stay silent this time? What if I stopped protecting people who'd never protected me? What if I finally made them see me, really see me, even if it meant burning everything down? The thought was dangerous, intoxicating, terrifying. And for the first time in my life, I didn't push it away. The days following the wedding invitation were strange. I kept returning to Emily's note those 2 inadequate words that somehow made everything worse. An apology without explanation is just another form of silence, and I'd had enough silence to last a lifetime. By the end of that first week, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in over a year. I drove back to Greenwich. I still had a key to the estate. My parents had never asked for it back, probably because asking would require acknowledging I existed. The house would be empty on a Wednesday afternoon. My mother had her standing charity board meeting, and my father would be at his office, maintaining the appearance of working despite having largely retired years ago. I told myself I was going to return the key to close that final door. But the truth was messier than that. I needed to understand something, though I couldn't have articulated what. The estate looked exactly as it always had, pristine, imposing, more museum than home. I let myself in through the side entrance, the familiar smell of furniture polish, and my mother's expensive perfume hitting me immediately. The house was silent in that particular way. Wealthy homes are silent, every sound absorbed by thick carpets and heavy drapes. I'd grown up in this silence, learning to move through it like a ghost. I found myself drawn to the library, a room my mother rarely used. She preferred the sitting room with its better lighting for her Society magazine photo shoots. The library was my father's domain, though even he didn't spend much time there. It was all for show, leather-bound books bought by the Yard First Editions, never opened, the kind of room that existed to signal cultivation to guests who'd never actually see anyone read in it. The photo albums were kept on the lower shelves, organized by year in matching leather binders. My mother's obsession with documentation, with curating the perfect family narrative. I'd looked through these albums before as a child, always struck by how few photos included me, and how in the ones that did, I appeared slightly out of frame, slightly out of focus, like I was already fading away. I pulled out the album marked 1987, the year before I was born. The pages were filled with the usual Grant Family Theater, charity galas, vacation homes, carefully staged holiday photos. My mother looked different than younger, obviously, but also somehow more alive, less polished, more real. There was a looseness to her smile in these photos that I'd never seen in person. Then, tucked in the back pages, I found it. A photograph that didn't match the others, not professionally taken, but a casual snapshot slightly blurred at the edges. My mother stood next to a man I'd never seen before, and the way they stood together made my breath catch. This wasn't the careful distance she maintained with my father in photos. This was intimate. her body angled toward him, his hand resting on her lower back, both of them looking at each other instead of the camera, the kind of photo you take when you forget anyone's watching. But it was the man's face that made my hands start shaking. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app using it as a mirror. The angular jawline was identical to mine. The deep-set eyes that had always looked wrong in the Grant family photos, too dark, too intense. The slightly crooked smile I'd inherited from nowhere, or so I'd thought. I was looking at features I'd seen in my own reflection every day of my life, and they belonged to a stranger. I turned the photograph over with trembling fingers. The inscription was faded, but legible, written in handwriting that definitely wasn't my mother's or father's Jonathan Reed, 1987. Jonathan Reed. The name meant nothing to me, but the date burned itself into my brain. 1987, the year before I was born, the year my mother looked happy in a way I'd never witnessed, the year she stood next to a man who had my face. I took several photos of the picture with my phone, making sure to capture both the front and the inscription. Then, I carefully replaced it exactly where I'd found it, sliding the album back into its slot. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As I left the library, I glanced around at the perfect house, the carefully curated life, the expensive silence. How many other secrets were hidden in these rooms? I drove back to Brooklyn in a daze, my mind racing with implications I wasn't ready to fully form into thoughts. Back in my apartment, I sat on my couch with my laptop and did what any person in the 21st century does when faced with a mystery I Googled. Jonathan Reed, 1987, brought up dozens of results, but I added Connecticut, and the search narrowed. The first result was an obituary from 6 months earlier. Jonathan Reed, 58, died in a single-car accident on Route 7. Survived by his son Ethan Reed. Services private. In lieu of flowers donations to the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I stared at the name. Ethan Reed. The same Ethan who was marrying my sister in 3 months. The son of the man who looked exactly like me, the man my mother had photographed with the kind of intimacy that rewrites family trees. My phone slipped from my hands onto the couch. This wasn't just about being excluded from a wedding anymore. This was about something much bigger, much darker, buried for 36 years. And somehow, impossibly, my sister was about to marry into it. I spent the next 2 days staring at Jonathan Reed's obituary on my laptop screen, trying to make sense of what felt like puzzle pieces from different boxes forced together. The coincidence was too massive to ignore my mother photographed with a man who shared my features, and now his son was marrying my sister. But coincidences like that don't just happen in families like mine, where every detail is controlled, every connection carefully cultivated. I needed answers, and there was only one person I could try, even though I already knew how it would go. I called my father on a Thursday afternoon, timing it for when I knew he'd be between meetings, that brief window, when he might actually answer his personal cell. He picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice when he said my name. Nicole, is something wrong? The question itself was telling. He only expected to hear from me if something was wrong, as if I existed solely as a problem to be managed. I wanted to talk about the wedding, I said, keeping my voice steady. About Emily and Ethan. There was a long pause, and I heard him exhale slowly. Nicole, please don't make this complicated. Let your sister have her special day. Your mother and I have worked very hard to arrange this wedding, and we can't have disruptions. Disruptions. That single word landed like a physical blow. I wasn't a daughter to him. I was a disruption, a complication, something to be managed and contained. I just want to understand why I wasn't told about the engagement, I said, hating how small my voice sounded. Not invited to the party, that's one thing, but not even told. You know how your mother is, he interrupted, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. The same exhaustion I'd heard my entire life whenever I tried to hold him accountable. It's easier not to fight it. She handles these things, Nicole. She always has. I can't. He stopped himself. I won't get in the middle of this. Just let it go. He hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, realizing with perfect clarity that my father's passivity was somehow worse than my mother's active cruelty. At least Marjorie owned her decisions. Richard just surrendered to them and called it peace. But I couldn't let it go, not entirely. Some stubborn part of me still needed to try to prove that I could be the gracious one, the mature one, the daughter who rose above the pettiness. I spent an entire afternoon searching vintage shops in Brooklyn until I found an antique silver picture frame with delicate filigree work, the kind of timeless piece that might hold a wedding photo someday. It cost more than I should have spent, but I wrapped it carefully in ivory paper, wrote a simple card in my neatest handwriting, "Wishing you happiness, Nicole," and sent it to the Greenwich estate via courier. 4 days later, the package came back. I knew before I opened my apartment door and saw it sitting in the hallway. The return was too quick, too deliberate. The wrapping paper was still pristine, unopened, and taped to the top was a small card on my mother's cream-colored monogrammed stationery. Her handwriting unmistakable in its sharp, decisive strokes. "Stop inserting yourself where you're not wanted." I carried the package inside and set it on my kitchen counter, staring at those words until they blurred. The calculated cruelty of it struck me harder than any of the previous rejections. Marjorie had taken the time to write that note, to tape it to the package, to send it back. That required effort and tension. She wanted me to know that even my kindness was unwelcome. Even my attempts to be the bigger person were an intrusion. That night, Olivia came over with 2 bottles of wine and the kind of determination that made her an excellent attorney. She'd been my closest friend since college, one of the few people who'd witnessed my family dynamics firsthand and hadn't written me off as dramatic or oversensitive. "Tell me everything," she said, pouring us both generous glasses before I'd even finished explaining about the returned gift. I did. The engagement I learned about through Facebook. My mother's cold dismissal. The wedding invitation with Emily's hollow apology. The photograph of Jonathan Reed. My father's cowardice. And finally, the package sitting on my counter like evidence of my own irrelevance. Olivia listened with her lawyer face on the one that meant she was processing information and forming arguments. When I finished, she set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts compassion and frustration. "This isn't just exclusion, Nicole. This is systematic emotional abuse. You've been the scapegoat your entire life." She leaned forward, her voice intense. "I see this in family law cases all the time. One child is designated as the problem, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They blame you for everything, treat you as less than, and then point to your reactions as proof that you're difficult. It's gaslighting on a generational scale." I wanted to argue to defend them somehow, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right, and some part of me had always known it. "You can't earn love from people who've decided you're unworthy," Olivia continued. "They didn't fail you, they never tried. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can stop letting them define your worth." Her words settled over me like a heavy blanket, comforting and suffocating at once. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. 3 days later, I received an email from Richard's accountant. There were some old tax documents that needed my signature, a technicality involving a property sale from years ago. Could I come by the estate to sign them? My father would be there to notarize. I almost said no, but curiosity won, or maybe that old instinct to comply with their requests to prove I was cooperative. Reasonable, not the disruption they claimed I was. The estate was quiet when I arrived Tuesday morning. My father met me in the foyer with the documents, barely making eye contact as he explained what needed to be signed. The whole interaction took less than 5 minutes. As I turned to leave, I heard my mother's voice coming from the study down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and her tone made me freeze. "As long as Ethan signs those papers, we're safe," she was saying, her voice low but clear. "The wedding will secure everything we need. Emily knows what she has to do." There was a pause, presumably the other person speaking. "No, Nicole won't be a problem. She never is." I stood in that hallway, my hand still on the documents I'd just signed, and felt something cold settle into my chest. What papers was Ethan signing? What did Emily know to do? And what exactly did this wedding secure? I left quietly. My father already disappeared into another room. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel. The pieces starting to arrange themselves into a pattern I couldn't quite see yet, but knew was there. They weren't just excluding me from a wedding. They were hiding something big enough to orchestrate an entire marriage around. And whatever it was, they were confident I'd never figure it out. Because I never was a problem. I never made waves. I always stayed silent. But maybe I thought as I started the engine it was time to stop being so predictable. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mother's words kept echoing in my head, as long as Ethan signs those papers, and Emily knows what she has to do. The clinical detachment in her voice suggested this wedding was a transaction, not a celebration. By 3 a.m, I was at my laptop, and I did what any graphic designer with too much time and too many questions does. I started digging. Ethan Wallace, or more accurately, Ethan Reed, though he used his mother's maiden name professionally. I found his LinkedIn profile, first CEO of Reed Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity firm he'd inherited 6 months ago when Jonathan Reed died. The company was valued at $47 million, with several government contracts and a reputation for cutting-edge security protocols. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man Marjorie would approve of, wealthy, established, connected. But the deeper I dug, the more complicated the picture became. Business journals from 5 years ago told a different story. Ethan had nearly bankrupted a previous startup with aggressive expansion and risky investments. One article called him brilliant but reckless. Another described him as a risk-taker who doesn't always calculate the odds. And he'd recovered clearly, but the pattern suggested someone who gambled big and didn't always win. This wasn't the stable conservative air my mother typically cultivated for her social circle. Unless, of course, the money itself was all that mattered, and she planned to control how it was spent. I moved on to Emily's social media, something I rarely looked at because it usually just made me feel worse. Her Instagram was public, surprisingly unguarded for someone raised by Marjorie. I started scrolling backward through her posts, looking for when Ethan first appeared. The engagement announcement was 3 months ago, a photo of them at some upscale restaurant, Emily's hand prominently displayed with that enormous diamond. But as I scrolled further back, something caught my eye. 4 months ago, there was a photo of Emily at a family brunch, and while everyone else wore fitted dresses, Emily was in a flowing tunic top, unusually loose for someone who typically showcased her figure. Then another photo from the same period, tagged by a friend I didn't recognize, Emily looking slightly green around the edges. The friend had commented, "How are you feeling? Morning sickness better," with a heart emoji. My mouth went dry. I checked the date again, did the mental math. If Emily had morning sickness 4 months ago, she would have been at least 2 months pregnant then. Which meant she'd conceived 6 months ago, 3 months before the engagement. That alone wasn't scandalous. Plenty of couples got engaged after finding out about a pregnancy. But given the rushed wedding timeline and my mother's obsession with appearances, I knew there had to be more to the story. I kept scrolling, going back further into Emily's feed. 8 months ago, the photos changed. There was a different man appearing regularly, Marcus Chen according to the tags. A graduate student at Yale based on his own profile, studying environmental science, wearing thrift store jackets and genuine smiles. The photos of Emily with Marcus had a warmth I'd never seen in her carefully curated posts. They were at coffee shops, hiking trails, casual places where my mother would never be photographed. In one image, Marcus had his arm around Emily's waist, and she was looking at him like he'd hung the moon. Then, exactly 6 months ago, Marcus vanished from her feed entirely. 1 week, Emily was posting photos of them at a farmer's market. The next week, there were only solo shots or pictures with girlfriends. And 2 weeks after that, Ethan appeared. The timeline assembled itself in my mind like a prosecution's case. Emily got pregnant by Marcus, someone completely unsuitable by Marjorie's standards. No money, no connections, wrong background. Marjorie found out and went into damage control mode. She couldn't have a scandal, couldn't have her daughter raising a child with a graduate student who probably survived on ramen and student loans. So she found Ethan Reed freshly wealthy from his inheritance, probably vulnerable after losing his father, and orchestrated a marriage that would legitimize the baby and secure the family's social standing. Emily was traded like a commodity, and Ethan was buying something he didn't even know was counterfeit. But I needed proof of the transaction itself. Using my graphic design credentials, I crafted a professional email posing as a vendor coordinator for the wedding, complete with a fake company signature. I wrote to Ethan's executive assistant explaining that I needed to verify payment routing for floral arrangements, and could she please confirm the billing entity. It was a long shot, but assistants dealt with hundreds of vendor emails, and if I sounded official enough, she might not question it. 2 days later, she responded with an apologetic note about the delay and attached a PDF labeled Wedding Budget and Vendor Payments. I opened it with shaking hands, expecting nothing more than a list of caterers and photographers. Instead, buried in the attachments was a separate document, Grant Consulting LLC, Advisory Services Agreement. I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding. But the language was clear, brutally transactional. Ethan Reed agreed to pay Grant Consulting, my mother's company, $5 million upon successful project completion. The completion was defined in a dense paragraph of legal language that boiled down to one thing: formalization of family partnership through marriage. The payment schedule showed $2 million due at signing, $3 million due 30 days after the wedding. My mother had created a contract for her daughter's marriage. She was being paid $5 million to deliver Emily to the altar. This wasn't a prenup or a family business arrangement. This was Marjorie literally selling Emily's hand in marriage to cover up a pregnancy scandal and secure a fortune. I sat back from my laptop feeling sick. Emily wasn't just a pawn in whatever game my mother was playing. She was inventory. My email pinged with a new message, the preview showing it was from an encrypted address I didn't recognize. I almost deleted it as spam, but something made me open it instead. The message was brief. If you're who I think you are, we need to talk before the wedding. Check your spam folder for a private number. ER. Ethan Reed. He knew. Somehow he knew I was digging, and he wanted to talk. My hand hovered over the mouse, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment where I could either walk away and let whatever was going to happen, or step fully into whatever conspiracy my family had created. I checked my spam folder and found the number. The spam folder contained a single message from an encrypted Proton mail address. No subject line, just a phone number and brief instructions. Signal app, 8 p.m. tonight, this number only. I stared at it for a full minute, my cursor hovering over the delete button. Every instinct I'd developed over 36 years of surviving my family screamed at me to walk away, to let whatever was happening happen without my involvement. But I'd already crossed a line by investigating, and some part of me knew there was no going back to comfortable ignorance. I downloaded Signal at 7:30, my hands unsteady as I entered the number. At exactly 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I answered without saying anything, my throat suddenly tight. "You're Nicole Grant." The voice was male calm, with the kind of educated diction that came from expensive schools and careful upbringing. "The daughter they don't talk about. I've been trying to reach you for weeks, but your family's made sure you're isolated." "Who is this?" I managed, though I already knew. "Ethan Reed. I'm supposed to be marrying your sister in 2 months, but we both know this wedding is a lie." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "I know about the consulting contract. I know Emily's pregnancy timeline doesn't match our relationship. And I know your mother had a relationship with my father 30 years ago that she's spent decades trying to erase." My apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. "How do you know about your father and my mother?" "Because 3 months ago, before I agreed to this farce of an engagement, I hired a private investigator to vet the Grant family. What he found was disturbing enough that I almost walked away. But then I realized this was exactly the kind of situation my father spent his life trying to expose. Ethan's voice remained steady, almost clinical, but there was an undercurrent of something darker. Jonathan Reed didn't just know your mother, Nicole. She destroyed him. He told me the story in careful, measured detail. 30 years ago, while Marjorie was engaged to Richard Grant, she had an affair with Jonathan Reed. It wasn't casual by all accounts. They were genuinely in love, or as close to love as Marjorie was capable of. When she got pregnant, Jonathan proposed immediately. He was willing to marry her, to raise their child together, to build a life that had nothing to do with the Grant family wealth or social position. But your grandmother got involved, Ethan continued, and I could hear the bitterness creeping into his otherwise controlled tone. She showed Marjorie bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios. She made it clear that Richard Grant could provide a life Jonathan never could. So Marjorie made a choice. She told Jonathan this baby was Richard's, married Richard, and cut my father off completely. But he tried to fight it. I said, remembering the photograph I'd found the dates that didn't quite add up in my own childhood memories. For years. He filed paternity suits, hired lawyers, spent everything he had trying to prove you were his daughter. But the Grant family money crushed every attempt. They had better attorneys' connections in the court system, friends in every position that mattered. My father's marriage to my mother fell apart because he couldn't let go of you. His career suffered because he was spending all his time and resources on legal battles he couldn't win. And 6 months ago, he died in a car accident, still obsessed with finding the daughter he'd lost. Ethan's voice cracked on that last sentence, the first real emotion breaking through his careful composure. His last words were about you. He made me promise to find the truth, to make sure you knew he never stopped fighting for you. That's why I agreed to this wedding. Not because I'm a victim of your mother's manipulation, but because I finally have a chance to finish what my father started. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart hammering beneath my ribs. If you know all this, why go through with marrying Emily? Why not just walk away? Because if I cancel quietly, your mother destroys the evidence and moves on to her next scheme. She's done this before, Nicole. Grant Consulting has brokered at least 4 other marriages in the past decade, all with similar contracts, all covering up various scandals for wealthy families desperate to maintain appearances. If I walk away, she wins again, and some other family becomes her next victim. His voice hardened. But if I let her think she's won, if I walk into that wedding with documentation, she can't refute and expose everything in front of witnesses. I can make sure she never manipulates anyone again. I'm not the victim here. I'm the trap. The word hung in the air between us. A trap. This man wasn't stumbling into my family's dysfunction, he was weaponizing it. What do you need from me? I asked, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. Evidence. The original consulting contract, not just the copy my assistant accidentally sent you. Proof of Emily's pregnancy timeline and the real father's identity. Any documentation of my father's relationship with your mother. Letters, photos, court records. Medical records, if you can get them, though, that's a long shot. He paused. I have resources, money, investigators, legal team, but you have access to places and information I don't. You're invisible to them, which makes you the perfect person to gather what we need. And what do I get? The question came out sharper than I intended, but I'd learned enough in 36 years to know that alliances always had costs. Protection. When this explodes, and it will explode publicly, your mother will try to blame you. She'll paint you as the jealous sister, the bitter, excluded daughter who sabotaged a wedding out of spite. But if we do this right with proper documentation and legal backing, she won't be able to touch you. I'll make sure you're financially secure and legally protected. The Grant family will be too busy managing their own collapse to come after you. I thought about Emily's handwritten apology on that wedding invitation. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone casually dismissing me as something that would never be a problem. I thought about 36 years of being erased, blamed, and discarded. I'll help you, I said. Good. I could hear the satisfaction in Ethan's voice. I'll send you an encrypted folder with everything my investigator found. Review it. Start thinking about what you can access safely. We have 2 months, which sounds like a lot of time, but isn't when you're building a legal case strong enough to survive the Grant family attorneys. Ethan, I said, stopping him before he hung up. Why are you really doing this? Your father is gone. Revenge won't bring him back. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might not answer. Finally, he said quietly, My father died believing he'd failed you, that he wasn't strong enough or smart enough to protect his daughter from your mother's cruelty. I can't give him back his life, but I can give him the truth. And I can make sure Marjorie Grant never destroys another family the way she destroyed ours. After we hung up, a message appeared in Signal. Whatever happens, don't trust Emily completely. She's more involved than you think. I stared at those words, feeling the ground shift beneath me once again. My sister with her apologetic note and her loose clothing hiding a pregnancy that wasn't her fiancé's. How much did she know? How much was she participating in versus being manipulated into? And did it matter if the end result was the same? That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's warning not to trust Emily completely. The sister who'd sent that inadequate apology, who'd stood by silently through decades of our mother's cruelty, who was now carrying another man's child into a fraudulent marriage. What role was she playing in all of this? The question churned in my mind as I tried to sleep, and with it came a memory I'd spent years trying to forget. I was 10 years old, and it was the night of my mother's annual charity gala. The house had been transformed into something from a magazine spread, every surface polished to perfection, every detail orchestrated to showcase the Grant family's sophistication and generosity. I'd been instructed to stay in my room out of sight while the guests arrived. Emily, only 6, had been dressed in a velvet dress and paraded around as evidence of Marjorie's perfect motherhood. I'd been reading in my room when I heard the crash, a shattering sound followed by Emily's small gasp of fear. I ran to my mother's dressing room and found Emily standing frozen among the pieces of an antique music box, a family heirloom that had belonged to my grandmother. The delicate mechanism was destroyed, the hand-painted porcelain lid in fragments on the hardwood floor. I was just looking, Emily whispered, tears already forming. I didn't mean to. Go back downstairs, I told her. I'll clean it up. But before I could even kneel down, my mother appeared in the doorway. She took in the scene with one sweeping glance, and her eyes landed on me with immediate accusation. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't look at Emily's guilty face or my empty hands. She simply grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and dragged me toward the stairs. You're deliberately sabotaging this family, she hissed, her voice low and venomous as she pulled me up to the 3rd floor. The attic storage room was cold and dark, filled with old furniture draped in sheets like ghosts. She shoved me inside and locked the door from the outside. You can stay here until you learn some respect. I spent that entire night in the darkness listening to the sounds of the party below. Laughter floated up through the floorboards, the clink of champagne glasses, the string quartet my mother had hired. I was 10 years old, cold and hungry and scared, while my family entertained Connecticut's elite as if nothing was wrong. Emily never confessed. My father never came to check on me. In the morning, Marjorie unlocked the door without a word and went about her day as if she hadn't imprisoned her own daughter for something she didn't do. That was the night I learned that in my family, truth was irrelevant. Survival meant accepting whatever role they assigned me, and my role was to absorb the blame for everyone else's mistakes. Now sitting at my kitchen table in my Brooklyn apartment 26 years later, I opened my journal and wrote, I learned that silence was sometimes the only way to survive in a house that was loud with lies. If I didn't speak, I couldn't be accused of saying the wrong thing. If I didn't defend myself, I couldn't be punished for talking back. Silence became my armor, but it also became my prison. I survived by disappearing, and now they treat me like I was never there at all. The next morning, I found a small package in my mailbox. No return address, just my name printed in neat block letters on the brown paper wrapping. Inside was a USB drive and a folded note. I recognized Emily's handwriting before I even read the words. I couldn't give this to you in person. Mom watches everything. There are 47 recordings on here spanning 2 years. I started recording after she made me get rid of my first pregnancy. I was too scared to use them alone. Maybe you're brave enough. I'm sorry for everything. E. My hands shook as I carried the package upstairs. First pregnancy. Emily had been pregnant before I plugged the USB into my laptop and stared at the folder that appeared. 47 audio files, each labeled with dates and brief descriptions. Mom plus Patricia lawyer. Prenup discussion. Mom plus phone call. Trap him with the contract. Mom plus Richard. Nicole was never supposed to exist. I sat there for a long moment, my finger hovering over the first file. This was it. This was Emily's arsenal evidence she'd been collecting, while I thought she was just another complicit member of the family that had rejected me. She'd been recording our mother's manipulation, documenting the conspiracy, building a case she was too afraid to use herself. But why now? Why send it to me after years of silence, after standing by while I was excluded and blamed and erased? Was this genuine rebellion or another manipulation? Was Emily trying to save herself? Or was this part of some larger scheme I couldn't see yet? I clicked on the file labeled Mom plus Richard. Nicole was never supposed to exist. My mother's voice filled my apartment crystal clear, recorded sometime in the past year based on the date stamp. Richard, I don't want to discuss this again. Nicole was never supposed to exist, and every day she does is a reminder of my biggest mistake. I chose you. I chose this life. But I can't look at her without seeing him, and I can't see him without remembering everything I gave up. There was a pause, then my father's voice weary and resigned. You could try treating her like a daughter instead of a problem. She is a problem. She's always been a problem. And now, with Emily's situation, the last thing we need is Nicole asking questions or interfering. It's better if she stays away. It's always been better when she's not around. The recording ended. I sat in the silence of my apartment, tears streaming down my face, finally hearing what I'd always known, but never had confirmed. My mother hadn't just been cruel. She'd been deliberate, strategic. My existence was an inconvenience to be managed, and my exclusion wasn't an oversight. It was the point. I opened the note from Emily again, reading between the lines of her apology. She'd started recording after being forced to abort her first pregnancy. She'd been collecting evidence for 2 years, and now pregnant again with Marcus's child and trapped in a marriage scheme, she was finally reaching out. Emily wasn't just a passive victim. She'd been planning something, building towards something, waiting for the right moment or the right ally. And apparently, that ally was me, the sister she'd watched suffer for decades, the scapegoat she'd never defended. I thought about Ethan's warning not to trust her completely. But as I looked at the 46 other recordings waiting to be heard, I realized trust might be less important than usefulness. Emily had given me weapons. Whether she was a genuine ally or just using me for her own escape didn't matter as much as what we could accomplish together. I clicked on the second recording. I spent the next 3 days listening to those recordings, each one more damning than the last. My mother's voice became a soundtrack to my insomnia, her calculated cruelty playing on a loop while I tried to process decades of abuse finally given a voice. I was on recording number 23 when my phone rang at 2 a.m. The caller ID showed blocked number, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then something made me answer. I know you got the USB drive. Emily's voice was wrecked raw from crying, barely above a whisper. I know you probably hate me. I hate me too. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Emily, I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about what's on those recordings, about what you must think of me now. Her words tumbled out in broken fragments, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath. I'm so scared, Nicole. I'm terrified of becoming her. I'm terrified of bringing a child into this family, into this toxicity. But I'm more terrified of what happens if I don't go through with this wedding. What do you mean? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Mom told me if I don't marry Ethan, she'll make sure I lose custody of the baby before it's even born. She has lawyers ready, Nicole. She said she'll prove I'm mentally unstable, that I can't take care of a child, that Marcus is an unfit father because of his financial situation. Emily's voice cracked. She showed me the documents. She's already started building a case. Medical records, she's somehow obtained statements from people I don't even know, a whole file on Marcus's student debt and his family's background. She's going to take my baby and give it to some family she can control, and I won't be able to stop her. I closed my eyes, feeling sick. Of course Marjorie had a contingency plan. Of course she'd already weaponized the legal system, lined up her pieces on the board, prepared for every possible resistance. That's what she did. She didn't just manipulate, she built insurance policies. I used to think Mom loved me more than you, Emily continued, her voice dropping to something that sounded like shame. I thought I was special, that I'd earned something you hadn't. But listening to those recordings, hearing how she talks about me when I'm not there, I finally understand. She doesn't love either of us. We're just assets to her, tools. And I'm so tired of being a tool. As Emily talked, I heard myself in her words. The younger version of me who'd tried so hard to earn Marjorie's approval, who'd believed that being good enough, quiet enough, perfect enough, would finally make her mother see her as worthy of love. Emily had been living in the same cage, just decorated differently. Where I'd been punished through exclusion and blame, Emily had been controlled through conditional acceptance and the constant threat of losing favor. Both were forms of abuse. Both left scars. I'm sorry I never defended you, Emily said suddenly. I'm sorry I let her blame you for things I did. Sorry I stood there silent while she erased you from family events. Sorry I benefited from your suffering. I was a coward. I still am. You were a child, I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. We both were. She made us that way on purpose. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, I made my decision. Emily, I'm going to use the recordings, not to hurt you, but to free us both. Can you handle what happens next? The pause stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. Then, I don't know. But I know I can't keep living like this. Do what you need to do. Just tell me when it's coming so I can breathe before everything explodes. I promise, I said. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my bedroom watching the city lights filter through my curtains. This had started as a need to understand why I'd been excluded, then evolved into a desire for justice, maybe even revenge. But now, listening to Emily's broken voice, I realized it had become something bigger. This wasn't just about exposing Marjorie's cruelty. It was about breaking a cycle that would otherwise consume another generation. If Emily had this baby while still under our mother's control, that child would become another tool, another victim in Marjorie's endless game of manipulation. For the first time in my life, Emily and I might actually be on the same side. The next morning I went to get coffee from the shop 2 blocks away, my usual Sunday routine. When I returned to my apartment building, I noticed my door wasn't quite flush with the frame. The lock hadn't been broken, but the door was open just enough that I could see a sliver of my kitchen. My heart started pounding as I pushed it open carefully, looking for signs of a break-in. Nothing obvious was missing. My laptop was still on my desk, my camera equipment still in its bag. But something felt wrong. Papers on my counter were organized differently than I'd left them. My laptop had been moved a few inches to the left. Drawers in my kitchen weren't quite closed all the way. Someone had been in here searching for something, trying to be subtle about it, but not quite subtle enough. Then I saw it. Sitting in the center of my kitchen counter, positioned deliberately where I couldn't miss it, was a photograph I hadn't seen in years. It showed our family at some holiday gathering, me around 8 years old, standing slightly apart from the rest. I recognized it as one that used to hang in the hallway of the Greenwich estate. I picked it up with shaking hands and turned it over. On the back, in my mother's distinctive handwriting, was a fresh note written in black ink. "We've covered worse sins before. Don't test me." The message was clear. Marjorie knew I was investigating. She'd sent someone to my apartment to search it to see what I knew, what evidence I might have gathered. And she wanted me to know that she knew wanted me to understand that she was watching, that she was always 3 steps ahead. But the note also revealed something else. She was worried. If she weren't, she wouldn't have bothered with the threat. Marjorie only deployed intimidation when she felt her control slipping. I pulled out my phone and opened Signal, my fingers moving quickly across the screen. "We need to move faster," I typed to Ethan. "She knows." The response came within seconds. "How much does she know?" "Enough to send someone to search my apartment. Enough to threaten me. We have 6 weeks until the wedding. If we wait much longer, she'll destroy whatever evidence we don't already have." 3 dots appeared indicating he was typing. Then, "Meet me tomorrow. I'll send you the location. It's time to finalize the plan." I looked at the photograph still in my hand at my 8-year-old self standing alone in a family portrait. That little girl had learned to survive by staying silent, by accepting whatever cruelty came her way. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. I was done being silent. The meeting location Ethan sent was a cafe in a small town 2 hours north of the city, the kind of place where no one would recognize either of us. But before I could meet him, I needed answers to questions that had been forming since I'd found that photograph of Jonathan Reed. Ethan had access to legal documents through his attorneys, and within 48 hours of my message, he'd sent me an encrypted file that made my blood run cold. Jonathan Reed hadn't just known my mother. He'd spent over a decade fighting for me in court. The sealed documents Ethan's lawyers obtained showed 3 separate paternity suits filed between 1989 and 1998, each one systematically blocked by the Grant family's legal team. The filings were desperate, increasingly frantic, as years passed. One included a letter Jonathan had written directly to the judge, and reading it felt like being gutted. "I know Nicole is my daughter. Marjorie Grant has used her husband's wealth and influence to keep me from my child for 8 years. Every day that passes is a day stolen from us both. I have tried every legal avenue available to a man of modest means, and each time I am crushed by attorneys I cannot afford to fight. I am asking this court to see past the money and recognize a father's right to know his own child." The judge had ruled against him. The Grant family money had won, as it always did. I sat at my laptop reading this letter from a man I'd never met, a man who'd wanted me while I was growing up, believing I was unwanted by everyone. The cruelty of it was staggering. While I was locked in attic rooms and blamed for broken vases, and taught that my existence was an inconvenience, Jonathan Reed was filing legal motions and writing desperate letters, fighting battles he couldn't win. But I needed more than legal documents. I needed scientific proof. During my last visit to the estate to sign those tax forms, I'd taken a glass from my father's study, one I'd watched Richard drink from. I'd felt ridiculous doing it like a character in a bad crime drama, but now I was grateful for the impulse. I'd also done a 23andMe kit 3 years ago, mostly to check for health markers after a friend's cancer scare. I'd never looked deeply at the ancestry data, but I still had the account. I sent both samples to a private lab that offered expedited DNA paternity testing. 3 weeks felt like an eternity, but finally the email arrived with the results attached. My hands shook so badly I could barely click the PDF open. The scientific language was clinical and definitive. Probability of paternity between submitted sample A and sample B, 0.00%. Genetic markers indicate no biological relationship between subjects. Richard Grant was not my father. 36 years of coldness, of passive complicity in my abuse, of choosing comfort over defending me, and he wasn't even my biological father. He'd raised another man's child, resented me for it every single day, and never once told me the truth. I didn't know whether to feel relieved that his rejection had a reason beyond my own inadequacy, or furious that he'd punished me for a situation I had no control over. But the relief and rage were quickly swallowed by a more horrifying realization. If Richard wasn't my father, then Jonathan Reed was. And if Jonathan Reed was my father and Ethan Reed was his son, that made Ethan my half-brother, which meant Emily was about to marry my half-brother. The baby she was carrying, the wedding Marjorie had orchestrated with consulting contracts and legal threats. It was all leading toward what amounted to incest. My mother knew. She had to know. She'd known for 36 years exactly who my father was, and she was still pushing this marriage forward. The implications made me physically ill. I sent Ethan a message through Signal, "We need to meet in person, now. There's something about our connection you need to know." When I walked into that cafe 3 days later, Ethan was already there sitting in a back corner booth away from windows. He looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes, his usual composed demeanor cracking at the edges. I slid into the seat across from him and pulled out the folder I'd prepared, DNA results, court documents, the timeline I'd constructed showing how all the pieces fit together. He read through everything in silence, his face growing paler with each page. When he finally looked up at me, his voice was barely audible. "That means you're my sister." The word hung between us, redefining everything. We'd been strangers then, allies, then co-conspirators in exposing my mother's fraud. But now we were family in the most fundamental biological sense. I had a brother, not Richard's passive cowardice or Emily's complicated victimhood, but an actual sibling who shared my blood, my history of being destroyed by Marjorie Grant. "My father died searching for you," Ethan said, and his controlled composure was starting to fracture. "He never remarried after my mother left him because he couldn't let go of what Marjorie had done. His whole life was consumed by losing you, by the injustice of having his daughter stolen. And now I find out that not only did Marjorie steal his daughter, she's about to use my grief over his death and Emily's pregnancy to trap me in a marriage that's functionally incestuous." The rage in his voice was like ice cold and sharp and deadly. This wasn't hot anger that burned out quickly. This was calculated fury that would wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike. "Does Emily know?" he asked. "I don't think so. She thinks Richard is my father. Everyone does." I leaned forward. "But Marjorie knows. She's always known. And she's willing to let you marry Emily anyway, even knowing what it means." Ethan's jaw clenched. "She's covering up one scandal by creating another. Emily's pregnant with another man's child, so Marjorie arranges a marriage to legitimize it. The fact that the groom happens to be her other daughter's half-brother is just collateral damage." We sat there in that quiet cafe, two people who'd been searching for truth, and found ourselves tangled in a web more twisted than either of us had imagined. I thought about Jonathan Reed's letter to that judge about his decade of fighting for me, about how he'd died 6 months ago, still believing he'd failed. "If I am Jonathan's daughter," I said quietly, "then my sister is about to marry our brother, and our mother knows it." Ethan's eyes met mine, and I saw in them the same determination I felt crystallizing in my own chest. This wasn't just about exposing fraud anymore. This was about stopping something fundamentally wrong, about protecting Emily from a situation she didn't understand, about making sure Marjorie's willingness to sacrifice anyone for her own comfort finally had consequences. "We have 5 weeks until the wedding," Ethan said. "We need to make sure everyone knows the truth before Emily walks down that aisle." The preliminary DNA results from the private lab had been damning enough, but Ethan insisted we needed official documentation that would hold up in court. He arranged for a more comprehensive test through a certified facility, one whose results could be submitted as legal evidence. The process took 3 weeks, and every day of waiting felt like existing in suspended animation, knowing the truth, but not yet able to prove it definitively. The envelope arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday morning in mid-March. I'd asked Olivia to be there when I opened it, needing a witness who wasn't emotionally entangled in the Reed family complications. She sat beside me on my couch, her lawyer composure firmly in place as I broke the seal with shaking hands. The report was thick, full of technical language and genetic markers that meant nothing to me until I reached the conclusion page. Probability of paternity between submitted sample A and sample B, 0%. Genetic markers indicate no biological relationship between subjects. Sample A was Richard Grant. Sample B was me. The numbers were absolute, irrefutable. Richard Grant had raised me for 36 years, had stood by while his wife abused me, had chosen silence and scotch over defending me, and I wasn't even his biological child. The second page made my chest tighten. Ethan had obtained genetic markers from Jonathan Reed's medical records, apparently something you could access as next of kin after death. The comparison to my DNA was equally definitive. Probability of paternity 99.97%. Conclusion. Subject B is the biological daughter of Subject C. I stared at that number 99.97% and felt the ground shift beneath me. Jonathan Reed was my father. The man in the photograph, the man who'd filed desperate legal motions, the man who'd died 6 months ago still searching for me. He'd been right all along, and Marjorie had spent 36 years making sure he could never prove it. Olivia took the papers from my trembling hands and read through them silently. When she looked up, her professional mask had cracked. "Nicole, this is fraud on a massive scale. Your mother didn't just lie, she orchestrated a legal deception that lasted decades. But I needed more than DNA results. I needed to understand the mechanism of the lie, how Marjorie had made it legally binding." The next afternoon, I returned to the Greenwich estate during one of my mother's charity luncheons. The house was empty except for the housekeeper, who was used to seeing me occasionally and barely looked up from her cleaning. Richard's study had always been off-limits during my childhood, but I knew he kept important documents in a locked file cabinet behind his desk. The key was hidden in a hollowed-out book on the shelf, a pathetically obvious spot I'd discovered years ago when I was 14 and curious. Inside the cabinet, arranged with meticulous organization, were decades of financial records, property deeds, and family documents. My birth certificate was in a folder labeled simply Nicole. I pulled it out and studied it under the desk lamp. The paper felt wrong somehow, the weight and texture inconsistent. I'd seen my own birth certificate before for passport applications, but I'd never examined it closely. Now, looking at it with suspicious eyes, I noticed the physician's signature at the bottom looked oddly uniform, too perfect, almost stamped, rather than the natural variation of handwriting. I photographed every angle of the document and sent the images to Ethan. Within 2 days, his forensic document analyst sent back a report that confirmed what I'd suspected. The expert had examined the digital images with enhancement software and found evidence of alteration. The original physician's signature had been replaced with a forgery likely done shortly after the original filing. The paper showed signs of chemical treatment to artificially age the replaced section to match the rest of the document. The conclusion was unambiguous. My birth certificate had been fraudulently modified to list Richard Grant as my father. Marjorie hadn't just lied to Richard, to Jonathan, to me. She'd committed actual document fraud, a crime that would have sent anyone else to prison. But she'd had money and connections and the kind of social power that made inconvenient truths disappear. I spread all the evidence across my kitchen table. DNA results, the forged birth certificate analysis, Jonathan's court filings, the timeline of events. Every piece fit together like a prosecutor's dream case. Marjorie had gotten pregnant during her affair with Jonathan Reed while engaged to Richard Grant. She'd faced a choice between love and money, between the man who wanted her and the man who could give her the life she thought she deserved. She'd chosen Richard's wealth and status, convinced him the baby was his, and used forged documents and legal intimidation to erase Jonathan from the picture entirely. Jonathan had fought back for over a decade, filing lawsuit after lawsuit, each one crushed by Grant family attorneys. His marriage to Ethan's mother had collapsed under the strain of his obsession with the daughter he'd lost. His career had suffered as he poured resources into legal battles he couldn't win. And through it all, Marjorie had raised me while resenting every moment of my existence. Sitting alone in my apartment that night, I finally understood the pattern I'd lived with my entire life. I spoke the words aloud, needing to hear them to make them real. She didn't punish me because I was bad. She punished me because every time she looked at me, she saw him, Jonathan, the man she betrayed for money and status. I was the consequence of her choice, the proof she'd chosen wrong, and she hated me for making her feel guilty. The realization settled over me like a weight lifting. For 36 years, I'd believed I was inherently flawed, that there was something wrong with me that made me unlovable. But I wasn't rejected because I was unworthy. I was rejected because I was a mirror that reflected back Marjorie's own moral bankruptcy, and she couldn't stand to look at it. Every time she blamed me for something I didn't do, she was really blaming herself for the choice she'd made. Every time she excluded me from family events, she was trying to exclude the evidence of her betrayal. Every time she looked at me with contempt, she was seeing her own capacity for cruelty reflected back at her. The understanding didn't make the abuse hurt less, but it removed the poison of self-blame I'd carried all my life. This wasn't about me. It had never been about me. I was just collateral damage in Marjorie's war with her own conscience. I looked at the evidence spread across my table. The DNA results, the forged documents, the court records, the photographs, and whispered into the silence of my apartment. Now I understand why she never loved me. I was never hers to love. Understanding why my mother had hated me didn't make the hate hurt less, but it did give me something I'd never had before: clarity. And with clarity came purpose. I spent the next week working with a focus I'd never brought to any design project, treating this like the most important assignment of my life. Because it was. I created a master folder on an encrypted drive, organizing everything with the same meticulous attention to detail my mother used when planning her charity galas. First went the DNA lab reports, both the preliminary results and the official certified documentation showing Richard Grant had zero biological connection to me, and Jonathan Reed was my father with 99.97% certainty. I included the chain of custody paperwork proving the samples hadn't been tampered with, contact information for the lab director who could testify to the validity of the results. Next was the forensic analysis of my birth certificate, complete with high-resolution photographs showing the inconsistent paper quality and the stamped physician signature. The document examiner's report was damning clear evidence of fraud, with technical specifications about the type of forgery used and the approximate timeline of when it had been altered. I added this expert's credentials and contact information as well. Emily's USB drive went into the folder as a compressed file containing all 47 audio recordings. I'd listened to every single one, cataloging them by topic and date, creating a reference guide that would let someone find exactly what they needed. Marjorie discussing the consulting contract. Marjorie threatening Emily about custody. Marjorie admitting I was never supposed to exist. Each recording was tagged with timestamps and key phrases, turning Emily's desperate evidence collection into a prosecutable case. The fraudulent consulting contract came next, the document where my mother had literally put a price tag on Emily's marriage: $5 million for delivering her daughter to the altar. I included the email chain from Ethan's assistant that had accidentally sent it to me, establishing how I'd obtained it, making sure the chain of evidence was clean. I added the social media timeline I'd constructed showing Emily's pregnancy predated her engagement, complete with screenshots and archived posts in case anything was deleted. Photos of Emily with Marcus Chen from 8 months ago. The telling comment about morning sickness, the sudden disappearance of Marcus from her life exactly when Ethan appeared. The pattern was undeniable. Financial documents came next. Records I'd photographed during my visits to the estate showing suspicious payments to Grant Consulting, LLC from multiple wealthy families over the past decade. Marjorie had been running this scheme for years, and I had proof of at least 6 other families who'd paid for her matchmaking services, though I didn't know the full details of those arrangements. Finally, I included every court document Ethan had obtained showing Jonathan Reed's decade-long fight for paternity rights. 3 separate lawsuits, all blocked by Grant family attorneys. Letters to judges begging for someone to see past the money. Medical records Jonathan had submitted trying to prove biological connection. The paper trail of a man systematically crushed by a legal system that favored wealth over truth. When I finished, I called Olivia and asked her to review everything from a legal perspective. She spent 6 hours going through the folder, making notes, checking sources. When she finally looked up from her laptop, her expression was grim. This is enough to destroy her credibility completely and potentially trigger criminal investigations, she said. The forged birth certificate alone is a felony. The consulting contract could be construed as fraud or even human trafficking, depending on how aggressively prosecutors want to pursue it. The audio recordings establish a pattern of manipulation and coercion. "Nicole, if you release this, your mother could go to prison." "Good," I said and meant it. I created a new Proton Mail account, untraceable, and composed a message to Ethan. I kept it simple. "You deserve the truth, even if it ruins us all. The wedding is in 2 weeks. Use this however you need to. She can't be allowed to hurt anyone else. N." I attached the encrypted folder with detailed instructions on how to access it, how to verify each piece of evidence independently, contact information for every expert who could testify to authenticity. This wasn't just exposing secrets. This was building a legal case that could withstand the best attorneys money could buy. My finger hovered over the send button for a long moment. Once I pressed it, there would be no taking it back. My family would implode. Emily would be caught in the blast radius. My mother's carefully constructed life would collapse. The Grant name would be destroyed. I pressed send. The relief that washed over me was unexpected. For 36 years, I'd been the victim, the scapegoat who absorbed blame, the excluded daughter who accepted rejection, the convenient target for everyone else's failures. But sitting there in my Brooklyn apartment, watching that email disappear into the encrypted void, I realized I'd become something else entirely. I was the architect of consequences, not destroying out of spite, but holding people accountable for decades of deliberate cruelty. The power no longer belonged to Marjorie. It belonged to the truth, and I was its messenger. I opened my journal and wrote, "For the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for someone to give me permission to matter. I'm taking up space, I'm making noise, and I'm not sorry." My phone rang 3 hours later. Ethan's voice was different when I answered, less calculated, more human, with something that sounded almost like awe underneath. "Nicole, what you sent me? It's everything we need. It's more than I hoped for." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "But I need you to know that once I use this, there's no going back. Your entire family will implode. Emily will be caught in the crossfire. Your parents' reputation will be destroyed. The media will dig into every aspect of your life. Are you absolutely certain you want this?" My answer came without hesitation. "I've spent my whole life protecting people who never protected me. I'm done. Do what needs to be done." The silence stretched for a moment. Then Ethan said quietly, "You won't need to lift a finger. I'll handle everything. Just be ready for the fallout." We talked for another 20 minutes about logistics, about timing, about how to ensure Emily wasn't completely destroyed in the process. Ethan had been planning this exposure for months, refining his strategy, and now with my evidence, he had everything he needed to make it undeniable. After we hung up, I sat in the dark of my apartment feeling strangely calm. No regret, no second guessing, just a clear certainty that I'd finally stopped letting fear dictate my choices. At midnight, my phone lit up with a final text from Ethan. "The wedding is in 12 days. I'm going to make sure she never forgets the daughter she tried to erase." I read those words 3 times, then turned off my phone and went to bed. For the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. The 12 days between sending Ethan that encrypted folder and the wedding passed in a strange blur of ordinary routine punctuated by extraordinary anticipation. I went to my freelance design jobs, I had coffee with Olivia. I lived my normal Brooklyn life while knowing that everything was about to explode. On the morning of the wedding, I woke at 6 and made the deliberate choice not to attend. This wasn't avoidance born from hurt or exclusion anymore. This was strategy. My physical presence would only complicate what needed to happen, would give my mother an easy target to blame, would distract from the evidence itself. I made a pot of coffee, dressed in comfortable clothes, leggings, and an oversized sweater, and settled onto my couch with my laptop. I'd done my research over the past week, identifying which of Emily's friends were likely to livestream the wedding. 3 separate Instagram accounts and 2 Facebook live streams gave me multiple angles on the ceremony taking place at the Grant Estates garden venue. I opened all 5 feeds in different windows, creating my own multi-camera production of my family's theater of perfection. The first streams went live around 10 in the morning, showing the venue setup. $400,000, Ethan had told me, that's what this wedding cost. I could see where the money went. Imported peonies and garden roses in massive arrangements flanking a white silk-draped arbor. A string quartet playing classical pieces I recognized from my mother's favorite composers. White chairs arranged in perfect rows for 200 guests, each one representing a connection my mother had cultivated over decades of social climbing. The sky was cloudless, the temperature perfect, as if even the weather had been ordered to comply with Marjorie's vision. Guests began arriving around 11, and I watched Connecticut's elite social circle parade into the garden. Women in designer dresses and statement jewelry, men in expensive suits, everyone performing the elaborate dance of air kisses and compliments that passed for affection in my mother's world. I recognized faces from charity galas, country club events, the society pages of local magazines. These were the people whose opinions mattered more to Marjorie than her own daughter's well-being. At 11:30, the ceremony began. Emily appeared at the end of the aisle in a gown that probably cost more than my annual rent, all silk and lace and architectural structure. She looked beautiful in the way magazine brides look, beautiful, perfect, and distant, and somehow not quite real. Her smile was practiced, the same smile she'd learned to deploy at family functions, but through the phone cameras I could see it didn't reach her eyes. Richard took her arm, and even through the small screen I noticed the slight tremor in his hands as they walked. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and the joining of two families. Standard wedding ceremony language words that probably sounded romantic to the guests, but felt hollow to me knowing what I knew. My coffee grew cold in my mug as I watched my heart pounding with anticipation that felt almost unbearable. I knew something was coming, but not when, not exactly how. I texted Ethan once, "Are you ready?" His response came within seconds. "Almost. Wait for my signal." The ceremony proceeded with traditional structure. Readings from poets about love and partnership. Vows that Emily and Ethan recited with appropriate solemnity, though I noticed Ethan's voice carried a strange undertone, something that might have been irony if you were listening for it. I watched as they exchanged rings as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, as Ethan leaned in to kiss Emily with careful, chaste restraint. The guests applauded. Someone in the back row whistled. The strings began playing a recessional piece. Confusion crept in as I watched Emily and Ethan walk back down the aisle together. Was he going to back out? Had he changed his mind? Had I sent all that evidence only to have him decide the cost was too high? The live streams followed the crowd as they moved from the ceremony space to the reception tent. More elaborate decorations, tables set with china that probably cost more per plate setting than my monthly grocery budget centerpieces that reached absurd heights. The energy shifted from ceremonial to celebratory as champagne began flowing and guests found their assigned seats. Then Marjorie took the microphone. She stood at the head table resplendent in champagne silk that probably took 6 fittings to perfect and began her mother of the bride toast. Her voice carried across the tent with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent decades commanding rooms exactly like this one. "Today is a day I've dreamed about for years," she began, and I watched her face on 3 different phone screens, each angle showing the same triumphant smile. Seeing Emily and Ethan united brings together 2 families with such deep history. Many of you may not know this, but Jonathan Reed and I knew each other many years ago. We were close, and I always believed, perhaps romantically, perhaps presciently, that our children would one day bring together what was meant to be. Today, Emily and Ethan begin a legacy that will honor both the Reed and Grant names. I felt my blood run cold listening to her rewrite history in real time. She was turning her affair with Jonathan, her betrayal of him, her theft of his daughter, into some kind of romantic destiny story. She was standing in front of 200 witnesses and performing an act of historical revisionism so audacious it took my breath away. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and shamelessness. Through the live stream, I watched Ethan stand slowly from his seat. He moved with careful deliberation, walking around the head table to where Marjorie stood with the microphone. She turned to him with an indulgent smile, clearly expecting him to add some charming words to her toast to play his role in her perfect narrative. He took the microphone from her hand with a gentle gesture that looked almost courteous. But his face told a different story. This wasn't the expression of a happy groom preparing to thank his new mother-in-law. This was the face of a man who'd been waiting months for this exact moment, who'd planned every word he was about to say, who knew exactly what bomb he was about to detonate in the middle of his own wedding reception. I leaned forward on my couch, my cold coffee forgotten, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation. Ethan's voice through the microphone was conversational, almost gentle, the tone of someone about to explain something simple to people who'd been confused for far too long. "Thank you, Marjorie, for those lovely words about destiny. I'd like to add some context that I think our guests deserve to hear." The tent quieted, the ambient buzz of conversation dying, as 200 wealthy guests turned their attention to the groom. This was expected, the groom's speech probably something sentimental about meeting Emily, about love conquering all. I watched through 3 different phone screens as my mother smiled indulgently, clearly, thinking Ethan was playing his role in her perfect narrative. "My father, Jonathan Reed, died 6 months ago," Ethan continued, and something in his voice made the atmosphere shift. "His last words to me were about truth, how he'd spent 30 years searching for it, and how important it was that I finish what he started. So before Emily and I begin our life together, I want to honor my father by sharing some truths about this union." I watched Marjorie's smile freeze on her face, watched the subtle stiffening of her posture. She sensed something wrong, but couldn't yet identify the threat. Guests exchanged confused glances. At the head table, Emily's expression transformed from practiced bride happiness to something closer to panic. Richard reached for his Scotch glass with both hands. Ethan produced a tablet from inside his jacket pocket, the movement smooth and prepared. "What I'm about to share might be uncomfortable, but it's necessary." He touched the screen, and suddenly the large displays positioned around the reception tent screens that were supposed to show a slideshow of Emily and Ethan's relationship lit up with a document I recognized immediately. The Grant Consulting LLC Advisory Services Agreement filled every screen in high resolution. The key paragraph was highlighted. "Client agrees to pay Grant Consulting LLC the sum of $5,000 upon successful project completion, defined as formalization of family partnership through legal marriage." The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Someone near one of the live streaming phones said clearly, "Is that real?" Marjorie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the temporary flooring. Her face had gone from pale to flushed in seconds. "Ethan, this is not appropriate," she started, moving toward him. But Ethan's voice cut through, amplified by the sound system. "This is a contract where my mother-in-law essentially sold her daughter's marriage to me for $5 million. But it gets more interesting." He tapped the tablet again, and the screens changed to show an audio waveform. Then Marjorie's voice filled the tent crystal clear through speakers designed to carry music to 200 guests. "Emily's baby isn't Ethan's, but he'll never know if we handle this correctly. The marriage legitimizes everything." The tent erupted. Not loud chaos, but the particular sound of wealthy people trying to maintain composure while their worldview shatters sharp intakes of breath. Urgent whispers, the shuffling of chairs as people stood for better views. I watched through the live streams as guests pulled out their phones, dozens of them filming everything. Another recording played before the shock could settle. "We need to trap him with the contract. Once he's legally bound to Emily, he can't walk away without destroying his own company's reputation." Marjorie's voice again, discussing her son-in-law like he was a business acquisition. Emily stood from the head table, her face crumpling, and ran toward the exit of the tent. Her designer gown caught on a chair, and she stumbled, and for a moment I felt genuine sympathy pierce through my anticipation. Whatever Emily's complicity, she was also a victim being exposed in front of everyone she knew. Marjorie lunged toward Ethan, her composure completely shattered. Her hand came up, and for a moment, I thought she was actually going to slap him in front of 200 witnesses. Ethan stood perfectly still, making no move to defend himself or step back. The calm on his face was almost eerie. Marjorie's hand swung toward his face, but connected instead with the microphone still in his hand, creating a horrible crackling feedback through the sound system that made everyone in the tent wince. The force of her own swing combined with her high heels and the temporary flooring that shifted slightly under sudden movement threw off her balance. She stumbled backward, arms windmilling. Emily had turned back at the sound of the feedback, and she rushed forward, instinctively reaching for her mother, but she was 3 feet too far away. Marjorie fell not hard enough to seriously injure, but humiliatingly completely. Her champagne silk dress, the one she'd probably had custom-made, landed directly in a puddle of red wine someone had spilled moments before. The stains spread across the expensive fabric like blood. The image was perfect in its destruction. The impeccable Marjorie Grant, the woman who controlled everything, sprawled on the ground in front of Connecticut's elite with wine soaking through her dress, and her mask of perfection shattered beyond repair. Dozens of phones captured it from every angle. Ethan stepped forward not to help her up, but to look directly at the nearest camera, and his voice was clear and controlled. "This woman destroyed my father to protect her lies. She stole his daughter, bankrupted him with legal fees, and let him die believing he'd failed. Today we stop letting her destroy anyone else." The tent was absolute chaos now. Some guests rushing toward the exits, others frozen in shock, many filming everything. Richard had disappeared. I couldn't spot him in any of the livestream angles. Emily knelt beside Marjorie, crying, trying to help her mother stand, while Marjorie pushed her away. Through one of the Facebook live streams, I watched as Ethan walked calmly out of the tent, still holding the microphone. Someone shouted a question at him, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking, leaving behind the wreckage of a $400,000 wedding and 36 years of carefully constructed lies. I sat on my couch in Brooklyn, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was real. This was happening. After a lifetime of silence, the truth was exploding in the most public way imaginable. My phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had already posted a clip to Twitter. Then another notification. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. Within minutes, I watched the view counts climbing hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. The caption on the most shared version read, "The groom who exposed his bride's family on her wedding day full footage." The video of my mother falling of her lies being broadcast to 200 witnesses of her perfect world collapsing was going viral in real time, and I had helped make it happen. The video spread faster than I could have imagined possible. I watched it happen in real time from my laptop, refreshing social media feeds compulsively as the view counts climbed with dizzying speed. Within 24 hours, the footage had 8 million views across multiple platforms. TikTok users had edited it down to the most dramatic 30 seconds. Marjorie's voice admitting Emily's baby wasn't Ethan's, followed by her falsetto to appropriately dramatic music. Twitter threads dissected every detail of the consulting contract. Instagram stories showed the wedding from a dozen different angles as guests who'd been there shared their own footage, each wanting to claim they'd witnessed history. By 48 hours, the number had reached 20 million views. The hashtags #GrantWeddingScandal and #TruthRevealed were trending nationally. I lay on my couch scrolling through an endless stream of commentary from strangers who thought they understood what had happened based on 90 seconds of viral video. News outlets picked up the story with headlines that made it all seem both more and less real. Connecticut socialite exposed in wedding day fraud. Mother caught selling daughter's marriage for $5 million. The wedding toast that became a public confession. The comment sections were battlegrounds. Some people condemned Ethan for humiliating a family at their own wedding, calling him cruel and vindictive, saying he should have handled it privately. Others praised him as a hero who'd exposed toxic manipulation, calling him brave for refusing to be complicit in fraud. People who knew nothing about 36 years of abuse felt entitled to judge everyone involved. I read comments defending my mother, saying she'd been publicly destroyed by a vindictive man. I read comments calling Emily a gold digger who got what she deserved. I read comments speculating about me, the mysterious excluded sister some investigative internet users had discovered through old family photos. The social consequences came swiftly. Within 48 hours, 3 charity boards where Marjorie held positions requested her resignation. The statements were carefully worded, citing reputational concerns and fiduciary responsibility to our donors. But the message was clear: her scandal was toxic and they wanted distance. Richard's business took hits as partners quietly ended relationships, not wanting the Grant name associated with their firms. I saw a news clip of him leaving the Greenwich estate with suitcases, his face haggard, refusing to answer, shouted questions from reporters who'd camped outside the gates. The country club where my parents had been members for 40 years opened an ethics investigation. Former friends stopped returning their calls. I knew this because Olivia had contacts in that world who were more than willing to share gossip. The social circle my mother had spent decades cultivating evaporated almost overnight. Appearances and status were everything to these people, and the Grants were now a liability rather than an asset. Olivia stayed with me the first 2 nights after the wedding, sleeping on my couch, ordering takeout and letting me process out loud. I'd expected to feel triumphant watching my mother's empire collapse, expected vindication to feel sweet and clean. Instead, I felt hollow. This was my family, however toxic, being destroyed in real time for the entertainment of millions of strangers who would forget about them in a week when the next scandal broke. "You didn't do this to them," Olivia said on the second night, watching me stare at my laptop screen. "They did this to themselves. You just stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own actions." I knew she was right intellectually, but emotionally, I couldn't shake the image of my mother on the ground, her perfect facade shattered, or Emily running from the tent in tears. I'd wanted truth and accountability, but I hadn't fully prepared myself for what that would look like in practice: the collateral damage, the public humiliation, the totality of the destruction. On the 3rd day, an email arrived in my personal inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank, and when I opened it, there was just one paragraph. "You started this, didn't you? I know you gave him the evidence. You destroyed your own family for revenge. What kind of daughter does that?" The message was unsigned, but the email address suggested someone from Connecticut, probably from my parents' social circle. Someone who'd pieced together my involvement, who saw me as the villain in this story, rather than the victim finally fighting back. I stared at that accusation for a long time, my cursor blinking in a reply window. I typed, "the kind of daughter who was never allowed to be one." Then I deleted it without sending. Instead, I blocked the sender and closed my email. But the question lingered in my mind, echoing in the quiet of my apartment. Was I seeking justice? Or had I become just as destructive as the people who'd hurt me? Had I wanted truth, or had I wanted revenge? And was there a meaningful difference? My phone rang on the afternoon of the 3rd day, jolting me out of spiraling thoughts. The number was local, but unfamiliar. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd been getting random calls from reporters who'd somehow obtained my contact information, but something made me answer. "Hello. Is this Nicole Grant?" The voice was young female, careful. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Sarah Chen. My brother is Marcus." She paused, and I could hear her take a breath. "We need to talk about Emily's baby." I sat up straighter on my couch, my heart suddenly pounding. Marcus Chen. Emily's ex-boyfriend, the graduate student from the photos, the real father of the baby Emily was carrying. I'd never considered that his family might reach out, that they might have their own stake in this unraveling. "I'm listening," I said. Sarah Chen and I met at a coffee shop in Manhattan neutral territory, halfway between her world and mine. She was 24, a paralegal at a civil rights firm with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she didn't make moves without thinking them through first. She brought a folder of documents, and before I could even order coffee, she slid them across the table. "Marcus has been trying to reach Emily for 6 months," she said without preamble. "Your mother had him served with a cease and desist order threatening legal action if he made any further contact. We couldn't afford to fight the Grant family lawyers, so he stopped. But that's his child Emily's carrying, and he has a right to know what's happening." The documents showed Marcus's attempts to reach Emily, the threatening letter from Marjorie's attorneys, and a paternity test Marcus had secretly obtained that proved with 99.9% certainty the baby was his. Sarah wanted my help getting Marcus access to Emily now that Marjorie's power was crumbling. I agreed to try, though I had no idea if Emily would even take my call. But that conversation set off something bigger. Sarah mentioned the cease and desist to a journalist friend who was already investigating Marjorie's business practices. Within a week, major news outlets were running exposés on Grant Consulting LLC. What they found was staggering. The company had been operating for 12 years, and the financial patterns were damning. Payments from multiple wealthy families, each followed within months by marriages that seemed strategically advantageous. Marjorie hadn't just sold Emily's marriage, she'd been running this scheme for over a decade, brokering unions like a criminal matchmaker. The IRS announced an audit going back 10 years. Multiple banks froze accounts pending investigation. Richard's investment firm hemorrhaged clients, losing 60% within a week, as investors fled the toxic association with the Grant name. The $5 million Ethan had agreed to pay was frozen by his attorneys, who filed papers arguing the contract was obtained through fraud and coercion. The Grant family wealth wasn't destroyed overnight, but it was locked up, scrutinized, and rapidly diminishing. 2 weeks after the wedding, I drove back to Greenwich. I didn't know why exactly, just that I needed to see the house to witness the aftermath for myself. The estate looked different, approaching from the road curtains drawn on windows that used to showcase perfect interior design. The gate closed, the circular driveway empty of the usual staff vehicles that had always made the place feel alive with invisible labor. My key still worked. I'd half expected them to have changed the locks, but apparently that level of practical thinking had been beyond anyone in the chaos. I stepped into the foyer and was struck immediately by the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but something heavier, more complete. The silence of abandonment. Family photographs still lined the hallway, but now they looked different to me. Not memories, but evidence, proof of a family that had never actually existed the way these images suggested. The living room was partially dismantled moving boxes stacked haphazardly, some full and sealed, others half-packed, as if someone had started the task and then given up. Marjorie's collection of society magazines still sat on the coffee table, and I wondered if any of them now contained articles about her own fall from grace. I found myself climbing the stairs to the second floor, walking down the hall to what had been my childhood bedroom. The door was open. The room had been converted to a guest room years ago, redecorated in neutrals that erased any trace that a child had once lived here. I stood in the doorway, feeling like a ghost visiting her own past, looking at a space that should have been mine, but had been made deliberately generic, stripped of identity. The library drew me back downstairs, that room where I'd found the photograph of Jonathan Reed what felt like a lifetime ago. I moved through the shelves more thoroughly this time, looking for anything else that might have been hidden. In the back of a rarely opened cabinet beneath built-in shelves, I found an old wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside were letters, dozens of them written in my grandmother's handwriting. I'd been 12 when she died, and I remembered her as the only adult in my childhood who'd treated me with consistent kindness. Reading her letters chronologically, I watched a tragedy unfold in real time. She'd known about the affair with Jonathan, had begged Marjorie not to marry Richard for mere money. One letter from 1988 read, "Marjorie, you're using this baby as a bargaining chip for social status. Please don't do this. Money can't replace genuine love, and that child will pay the price for your choices." Another from 1995, when I would have been 7. "The way you treat Nicole breaks my heart. She's innocent in all of this, yet you punish her for reminding you of your own compromises. If you don't stop, you'll lose the only child who might have truly loved you." My grandmother had seen it all, had tried to stop. It had watched helplessly as her daughter became the kind of woman who could destroy her own child. The letters showed this wasn't sudden cruelty. It was a pattern, a choice Marjorie made repeatedly over decades. The final letter was dated 2014, shortly before my grandmother died. It was addressed to Nicole, open only if you're excluded from a family event. My hands shook as I read her words. My dear Nicole, if you're reading this, it means your mother has finally completed the isolation I feared. I'm leaving this letter with my attorney along with instructions for a trust fund I've established in your name, $15 million that your mother doesn't know exists. It comes from my inheritance, not the grant money, so she can't touch it. Use it to build a life where love isn't transactional. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you more while I was alive. You deserved better than this family gave you. Attached was a business card for a law firm in Boston with a handwritten note, present this letter and ID to claim your inheritance. I sat on the library floor, holding that letter, tears streaming down my face. My grandmother had tried to protect me the only way she could, had set up a safety net she knew I'd eventually need. $15 million she'd hidden from her own daughter to give to the granddaughter she knew would be cast out. I left the estate clutching the wooden box, my grandmother's final gift, heavy in my arms. As I reached my car, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. I recognized the driver immediately, Emily, visibly pregnant, now her face swollen from crying, getting out alone. She looked utterly broken, a ghost of the polished bride from 2 weeks ago. Our eyes met across the driveway, and I saw in her expression a question I wasn't sure I knew how to answer. We stood there in the driveway for a long moment, two sisters who'd been kept apart by design now facing each other over the wreckage of our family. Emily looked like she'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks. Her face was puffy from crying. Her designer clothes replaced with leggings, and an oversized sweater that couldn't quite hide her growing belly. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse and broken. I don't blame you for any of this. I'd have done the same if I were brave enough. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just gestured toward the house. Do you want to come in? She nodded and we walked together through the front door I'd just exited. We ended up in the library, the same room where I'd found our grandmother's letters minutes before. Emily looked around like she was seeing the space for the first time, or maybe saying goodbye to it. She lowered herself carefully into one of the leather chairs, one hand on her belly, moving with the particular caution of someone in their second trimester. The marriage was annulled 3 days after the wedding, she said quietly, staring at the empty fireplace. Ethan's lawyers filed on grounds of fraud. I didn't contest it. There wasn't any point. It was never real anyway. She looked up at me. Marcus came back when he heard about the scandal. Your friend Sarah reached out to him, told him what happened. We're trying to figure things out. He wants to be involved with the baby. I want that too. But I don't know how to do any of this without Mom controlling everything. You start by not telling her your plans, I said, sitting in the chair across from her. Emily laughed, but it came out as something closer to a sob. I blocked her number yesterday. She's been calling me dozens of times a day since the wedding, alternating between screaming at me for ruining everything and crying about how I need to come home so we can fix this together. Like, there's anything to fix. Like I want to fix it. She wiped her eyes. I can't save her. And I finally realized I can't let her poison my baby the way she poisoned us. For the first time, I heard my own thoughts echoed back to me in Emily's voice. You were the favorite, I said, not accusingly, but trying to understand. You got the attention, the approval, the love I never had. What was it like for you? Emily's face crumpled. You were excluded, so you knew you were the scapegoat. You knew it was abuse because it was so obvious. I was included, so I thought I was loved. But it was just a different kind of cage. She leaned forward, her words tumbling out. Every achievement was scrutinized. Was it good enough to reflect well on her? Every choice was dictated which school, which friends, which activities would look best. Every friendship was managed. She'd meet the parents first, decide if they were the right kind of people. She didn't love me. She owned me. And I let her because I didn't know there was another option. I thought that's what family was. I reached into the wooden box still sitting beside my chair and pulled out our grandmother's letters. I just found these. I think you need to read them. Emily took the letters with shaking hands and began reading. I watched her face as she moved through them chronologically, watching our grandmother try to save her daughter from becoming a monster and fail. When she got to the letter from 1995, the one about how the way Marjorie treated me broke our grandmother's heart. Emily started crying in earnest. She saw it, Emily whispered. Grandma saw what Mom was doing to you and she tried to stop it and Mom just kept going anyway. It's a pattern, I said. Our great-grandmother controlled Grandma using social status and money. Grandma tried to break the cycle but couldn't completely. She raised Mom in a slightly less toxic version of the same environment. And Mom learned that control equals safety, that emotions are weaknesses, that love is conditional and transactional. Emily looked up at me. She made us enemies instead of allies because she knew if we ever joined forces we'd see through her. Exactly. I felt something shift between us, the beginning of understanding, if not quite trust. We're not doing this to our kids. The cycle ends with us. I don't even know how to parent differently, Emily admitted. This is all I know. Then we figure it out together. We go to therapy. We read books. We make mistakes and apologize for them. We do literally anything except what they did. Emily nodded, wiping her eyes, then noticed the final letter still in the box. What's that one? I handed it to her and watched her read our grandmother's final message. When she got to the part about the $15 million trust fund, her eyes went wide. Nicole, this is yours. She meant this for you. We split it, I said immediately. $7.5 million each. We both need fresh starts and neither of us has to answer to anyone about how we use it. I can't take your inheritance. It's not about taking. It's about Grandma trying to protect us both in the only way she could. I leaned forward. You need financial independence to raise your child away from Mom's influence. I need security to stop making choices based on survival. We both deserve the freedom this money provides. Emily stared at me for a long moment, then fresh tears spilled over. I don't deserve your kindness. I stood by while she destroyed you for years. You were a child, we both were. She made sure we couldn't help each other. I stood up. But we're not children anymore, and we're not her prisoners. We get to choose what happens next. Emily stood too awkward with her pregnancy, and before I could process what was happening, she hugged me. It was brief and uncertain, but it was the first time my sister had voluntarily touched me with affection in as long as I could remember. We were walking toward our cars, still processing everything that had been said, when a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Two people in professional attire stepped out, and I felt my stomach drop even before they spoke. Nicole Grant and Emily Wallace, the woman said, holding up a badge. We're special agents with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We need to ask you both some questions about Marjorie Grant's business activities. The FBI agents introduced themselves as Patricia Reeves and Michael Torres, both in their early 40s, with the kind of professional composure that came from years of investigating white-collar crime. Agent Reeves did most of the talking, explaining that they'd been investigating Grant Consulting LLC for 6 months, following a tip from another wealthy family who'd suspected they were victims of matchmaking fraud. The wedding scandal had broken everything wide open, giving them the public attention and the whistleblowers they needed to build a prosecutable case. We're looking at multiple potential federal charges, Agent Torres said, pulling out a folder. Wire fraud for transferring money across state lines using false pretenses, tax evasion for unreported income on the consulting payments, and identity theft for using Nicole's name and social security number to open unauthorized accounts. My stomach dropped at that last part. What accounts? Emily agreed immediately to cooperate, almost desperately eager to distance herself from our mother's crimes. I was more hesitant, decades of being blamed for things I didn't do, making me instinctively wary of any authority figures asking questions. I called Olivia, who arrived within an hour and sat beside me as the agents explained what they needed. "You're a witness, Nicole," Olivia said firmly when I expressed my fears. "Not a suspect. There's a difference." The interview happened over several sessions at the FBI field office in Manhattan. On the second day, Agent Reeves showed me documents that made my hands start shaking. 3 bank accounts all opened in my name between 2010 and 2015, containing a combined total of $2.7 million in deposits and transfers I'd never made. The signatures on the opening documents were forged a decent approximation of my handwriting, but not quite right. My social security number had been used without my knowledge or consent. "Your mother opened these accounts when you were in your 20s. Agent Reeves explained, her voice carefully neutral. "We believe she used them to hide income from business deals she didn't want traced back to Grant Consulting. The money would come in through these accounts, get moved around through various transactions to obscure the trail, then eventually end up in accounts she controlled." "If you hadn't investigated thoroughly," Agent Torres added, "you could have been charged as an accessory to money laundering and tax fraud. These accounts are in your name with your social security number. A less thorough investigation might have assumed you were complicit." I stared at those documents, understanding washing over me in cold waves. My mother hadn't just used me as an emotional scapegoat. She'd set me up as a potential legal scapegoat too, creating a paper trail that would lead investigators to me if her schemes were ever discovered. It might not have been malicious. She probably thought she'd never get caught, that these accounts would remain hidden forever. But she'd been willing to put my freedom at risk for her convenience, just like she'd been willing to sacrifice my childhood for her social status. Over the next 2 weeks, I gave the FBI everything. The consulting contract showing the $5 million payment for Emily's marriage, all 47 audio recordings from Emily's USB drive, financial documents I'd photographed during my visits to the estate, email exchanges with Ethan documenting the scheme. I even provided the forged birth certificate and DNA evidence proving Jonathan Reed was my biological father, establishing a pattern of document fraud that went back 36 years. "Ms. Grant," Agent Torres said during our final meeting, "what you've given us is one of the most complete evidence packages we've seen in a white-collar case. Your mother made a lot of mistakes over the years, but her biggest one was underestimating you." The comment hit me strangely. My entire life I'd been told I didn't matter, that I wasn't smart enough, capable enough, important enough to be worth paying attention to. I'd internalized that message so deeply that even now at 36, I sometimes caught myself apologizing for taking up space. But federal agents were sitting across from me saying I'd built a case strong enough to send my mother to prison. I'd gathered evidence, documented crimes, connected dots they might have missed. The invisible daughter had made herself impossible to ignore. During the 3rd week of the investigation, I was at home working on a client project when Olivia called with news that made me stop breathing. Richard Grant had been found unresponsive in a Manhattan hotel room, an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside him. He'd been rushed to the hospital and survived, but it was clearly a suicide attempt. I felt a complicated rush of emotions I didn't know how to name. Richard had never been a real father to me. He'd been cold, complicit, choosing comfort and scotch over defending me every single time. But I didn't want him dead. Despite everything, I didn't want that. I visited him once, telling no one I was going. He was in a private room, heavily sedated but conscious, looking 20 years older than the last time I'd seen him. When I walked in, something that might have been shame crossed his face. "Nicole," he said, his voice rough from the intubation tube they'd removed hours before. I sat in the chair beside his bed, not knowing what to say. After a long silence, he spoke again. "I knew. About Jonathan. About the DNA. I knew from the beginning." The words hung at the sterile hospital air. I'd suspected, but hearing him confirm it made my chest tighten. "Then why?" "I wanted heirs. I wanted the appearance of family, the image of a successful marriage." He closed his eyes. "I was weak and vain, and you paid the price for my vanity every day of your life. I'm sorry." It wasn't absolution. It didn't undo 36 years of coldness and complicity. But it was the closest thing to truth he'd ever given me, and somehow that mattered. I stood to leave without saying anything more. There was nothing left to say to this man who'd chosen pride over protecting a child. My phone rang as I was driving back to Brooklyn. Agent Reeves's number appeared on the screen. "We're executing the arrest warrant tomorrow morning," she said without preamble. "Marjorie Grant will be taken into custody at 6 a.m. I thought you'd want to know." I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Tomorrow morning. After 36 years of unchecked cruelty, my mother would finally face consequences that couldn't be bought off or manipulated away. "Thank you for telling me," I managed to say. After I hung up, I sat in my parked car for a long time, watching traffic pass, trying to prepare myself for what tomorrow would bring. I didn't plan to witness my mother's arrest. I wanted to be anywhere else, far from the spectacle, letting justice happen without my presence complicating it. But the next morning, I found myself driving back to the hospital where Richard was still recovering, bringing some of his personal items that had been left at the estate. I told myself it was an errand, a practical task, but maybe some part of me knew what was about to happen and needed to see it. I was walking back to my car when I saw the black SUVs pull into the parking lot. 3 of them official and unmistakable. Agents Reeves and Torres stepped out of the first vehicle along with 4 other agents and 2 uniformed officers. My heart started pounding as I watched them enter the building with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. I should have left. I should have gotten in my car and driven away, let whatever was about to happen without me. Instead, I found myself following them inside, staying far enough back that they wouldn't notice me taking the stairs when they took the elevator. I knew where they were going. Marjorie had been staying in the hospital's psychiatric wing since Richard's suicide attempt, claiming extreme stress and exhaustion. Olivia had mentioned it was likely a legal strategy, a way to appear sympathetic and perhaps lay groundwork for a diminished capacity defense. I positioned myself down the hallway from her room, partially hidden behind a corner where I could see through the partially open door. My mother was sitting up in bed, but she wasn't dressed like a patient. She wore expensive loungewear. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup applied with the same precision she'd always demanded. Even here, even now, she was maintaining appearances. When the agents entered her room, I watched her face cycle through emotions in rapid succession. Shock when Agent Reeves announced they had a warrant for her arrest. Fury when Agent Torres began reading her rights. Calculation as her eyes darted around the room, probably searching for a phone to call her lawyer. And then, something else. Something I hadn't expected, a flicker of what looked almost like relief, as if some part of her had been waiting for this moment. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is harassment." Agent Reeves pulled out handcuffs, and that's when Marjorie's composure truly cracked. Her eyes swept the room desperately, and then she saw me standing in the doorway. Everything stopped. For 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, mother and daughter stared at each other across a space that contained 36 years of pain manipulation and opportunities for love that had been deliberately destroyed. "Nicole," she said, and her voice broke on my name. Tell them I didn't mean—" But I stayed silent. The same silence she'd taught me weaponized now, in a way she'd never anticipated. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and clear. "I was your daughter, but you made me a stranger." I turned and walked away before I could see her face change, before I could watch the handcuffs close around her wrists. I heard her call my name once more, desperate now, but I kept walking. Down the hallway, down the stairs, out to my car, where I sat gripping the steering wheel and shaking. Someone had tipped off the media. By the time the agents escorted Marjorie out of the building, cameras were positioned at every exit, reporters shouting questions, photographers jockeying for the best angle. I watched it later on the news from my apartment, Olivia sitting beside me on the couch. The footage showed my mother in handcuffs, her expensive loungewear looking absurd under the harsh television lights, her styled hair slightly disheveled, her face a mask of humiliation and rage. The former socialite reduced to a criminal suspect, her perp walk becoming the second viral moment in a scandal that refused to fade. I expected to feel triumph watching it. Vindication, satisfaction, the sweet taste of justice finally served. Instead, I felt a deep, hollow sadness that sat in my chest like a weight. This was justice, yes. My mother was facing consequences for decades of manipulation and fraud. But it didn't give me back the childhood she'd stolen. It didn't create the mother I'd needed and never had. It didn't undo 36 years of feeling like I was unworthy of love. "You did the right thing," Olivia said, watching my face instead of the screen. "I know," I said. "But doing the right thing doesn't mean it feels good." The calls started within hours. Producers from 60 Minutes, NPR, major newspapers, even book publishers. Everyone wanted my story, wanted me to tell my side, wanted the exclusive interview with the daughter who'd helped bring down her own mother. I ignored most of them, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but one caught my interest. A journalist named Diana Brooks, known for handling sensitive family stories with empathy rather than sensationalism. She'd done a documentary on survivors of parental abuse that I'd watched years ago, struck by how she let people tell their stories without exploitation. After talking it over with Olivia and Emily, I agreed to one interview. Diana would come to my apartment in 2 weeks, giving me time to prepare, time to figure out what I actually wanted to say. "Why are you doing this?" Olivia asked when I told her. "You hate being in the spotlight." "Because my mother controlled the narrative my entire life," I said. "Every story about our family was the story she wanted told. Every image was the image she curated. This time I'm telling my own story, in my own words, without her filter." The decision terrified me. I was intensely private by nature, had spent my life trying to be invisible. But I recognized this for what it was, an opportunity to reclaim not just the truth, but my own voice. To stop being the silent victim and become someone who spoke. Diana sent over a list of questions a week before the interview. Most were what I expected, asking about my childhood, the exclusion from the wedding, the decision to gather evidence. But the last question made me stare at my laptop screen for a long time. "If your mother is watching this interview, what would you want her to know?" I didn't have an answer yet, but I had a week to figure out what I wanted to say to the woman who'd spent 36 years teaching me I didn't matter now that the whole world was finally listening. The interview took place in a neutral studio. Diana Brooks had rented all warm lighting and comfortable chairs arranged to feel intimate despite the 3 cameras positioned around us. I'd spent an hour that morning deciding what to wear, finally settling on a simple navy sweater and minimal jewelry. No performance, no polish. Nothing that looked like I was trying to impress anyone. My mother would have been horrified by my lack of effort, which made the choice feel exactly right. Diana was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that made difficult conversations feel safe. She asked me to start at the beginning, and I did. I talked about my childhood, about being blamed for Emily's mistakes, about locked rooms and silent dinners, and the slow accumulation of evidence that I was unwanted. I talked about discovering the engagement on Facebook, about the wedding invitation, with Emily's inadequate apology, about the moment I decided to stop staying silent. "When did you decide to gather evidence against your mother?" Diana asked. "When I realized staying quiet was just another way of protecting her," I said. I'd spent 36 years absorbing her cruelty because I thought that was what daughters did, but I wasn't protecting our relationship. I was enabling her to hurt more people. When Diana asked about my mother, I paused for a long time, trying to find words that were honest without being performatively kind or vengeful. "I don't think my mother is a monster," I finally said. "I think she's a deeply damaged person who inflicted her damage on others. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps me understand it. I forgive her for being human. I don't forgive her for choosing to hurt us instead of healing herself." The interview aired on a Sunday evening in late June. 12 million people watched, which Olivia told me later was exceptional for that time slot. I couldn't bring myself to watch it live, so I went for a long walk through Brooklyn instead, my phone turned off, trying not to think about millions of strangers forming opinions about my life based on 60 minutes of edited footage. When I finally turned my phone back on, it had crashed from the volume of notifications. Olivia had helped me set up social media accounts specifically for this, and my email inbox was flooded with thousands of messages. I scrolled through them in shock, reading fragments of people's stories. Women in their 40s and 50s and 60s writing that they'd spent their entire lives feeling crazy that their families had gaslit them about their own experiences of favoritism and scapegoating, that seeing someone speak publicly about it made them feel less alone. The hashtag I was the scapegoat trended for 3 days. Support groups formed on Facebook and Reddit. Strangers shared stories about being the family scapegoat, about siblings who were golden children, about parents who'd made them believe they were the problem when really the family system was broken. My story had accidentally started a cultural conversation I hadn't intended but desperately needed. Emails came from prominent psychologists asking if they could reference my case in their work on family systems. A best-selling author on trauma wrote an op-ed for The Atlantic titled "Nicole Grant and the Children We Sacrifice for Appearances" that was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Universities invited me to speak at conferences on family dynamics and psychological abuse. I declined most of them, not ready for that level of public engagement, but each invitation confirmed something profound. My experience wasn't unique, and speaking about it was helping other people name their own pain. For someone who'd spent 36 years believing she was inherently flawed, the validation was healing in ways I couldn't have predicted. 1 week after the interview aired, a manila envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address. I opened it carefully, half expecting something threatening, but instead found dozens of photographs I'd never seen before. Images of me as a baby, as a toddler, ages 0 through maybe 5. And in every single one, my mother was there, smiling in a way I'd never seen in person, holding me with what looked like genuine tenderness. In one photo, infant Nicole was asleep on Marjorie's chest, and my mother's face showed something that looked startlingly like peace. In another toddler, Nicole was laughing at something, and Marjorie was laughing too, both of them caught in a moment of unguarded joy. These were the photographs of a mother who loved her child, who delighted in her, who saw her as precious rather than problematic. A handwritten note was tucked between the photos, written in my mother's distinctive script. "I did love you once before I taught myself not to. I'm sorry I couldn't remember how." I sat on my apartment floor staring at those photographs for hours, crying not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer complexity of it all. Here was proof that my mother had been capable of love, that there was a version of her who'd held me with tenderness, who'd smiled at me with genuine warmth. She'd chosen to suppress that capacity, had deliberately taught herself not to feel it, had spent decades punishing me for reminding her of the woman she used to be. The tragedy wasn't that she'd never loved me. The tragedy was that she had, and she'd decided that love was too dangerous to allow. It didn't change anything legally. It didn't make the abuse acceptable or erase the damage she'd done. But emotionally, it offered something I hadn't expected, a small, painful piece of closure. My mother hadn't been born incapable of love. She'd made herself that way, one choice at a time, until the woman in these photographs was buried so deep she couldn't find her way back. I looked at the note again and noticed a final line I'd missed the first time, written smaller at the bottom. "There's still something you don't know about the day you were born," asked Jonathan's lawyer. I stared at those words, feeling my chest tighten. What could possibly be left to discover? I knew Jonathan was my father. I knew Marjorie had lied about my paternity for 36 years. What else was there? I pulled out my phone and called the number for Robert Brennan, Jonathan's attorney, the man who'd given me my father's letters and established the trust fund. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Brennan, it's Nicole Grant. I need to know about the day I was born. My mother said there's something I don't know, and she told me to ask you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, "I was wondering when you'd ask about that. Can you come to Boston? This is something I should tell you in person." Before I could make the trip to Boston to meet with Robert Brennan, I became fixated on the photographs my mother had sent. I spread them across my kitchen table, examining each one carefully, looking for clues I'd missed in my initial emotional response. That's when I noticed the background. Several of the photos showed the same distinctive setting, a weathered beach house with faded blue shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of New England coastal architecture that looked like it had weathered 100 storms. I took close-up photos with my phone of the images that showed the most detail, then used reverse image search and examined every background element. In one photo, a street sign was partially visible. In another, a business name on a distant storefront. It took me 3 hours of detective work, but I finally identified the location, a small coastal town in Maine called Pembroke Bay, about 4 hours north of Boston. Property records showed the house had belonged to J. Reed from 1986 to 1989. Jonathan Reed. This was his house during the period when he and my mother were together when I was born, when everything fell apart. I booked a train to Portland for the next morning, then rented a car to drive the rest of the way. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Olivia. This felt like something I needed to do alone. The house was still there, perched on a small bluff overlooking the Atlantic. It looked older now, the blue shutters replaced with white ones, a new family's toys scattered across the lawn. I sat in my rental car for a long time, staring at this place where some version of my early life had happened, a life I had no memory of. Finally, I got out and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was kind when I explained I was researching my family history. She let me walk down to the beach below the house where I sat on the sand, watching waves crash against dark rocks. I walked into town afterward, asking random people if they remembered Jonathan Reed from 35 years ago. Most didn't, but an elderly man at the local diner directed me to a woman who'd lived in Pembroke Bay her entire life. She told me the house had been sold in 1989 after Jonathan Reed had some kind of family crisis and moved away suddenly. She mentioned he used to bring a young woman and a baby to visit his mother at the assisted living facility on the edge of town. The facility was a modest building with a view of the harbor, the kind of place that prioritized comfort over luxury. I explained to the receptionist that I was researching my family history, and after some hesitation, she introduced me to Mrs. Patricia Donovan, a nurse who'd worked there for 40 years and remembered almost everyone who'd passed through. Jonathan Reed, Mrs. Donovan said, her face lighting up with recognition. Of course I remember him. His mother Dorothy was with us from 1987 until she passed in 1991. Lovely woman, though she was heartbroken toward the end. She gestured for me to sit in the small staff break room. Jonathan used to bring his girlfriend and their baby here on Sundays. Dorothy adored that baby girl. She'd hold her for hours talking about how she finally had a granddaughter. Do you remember the girlfriend? I asked, my voice barely steady. Marjorie, I think her name was. Beautiful woman, but she always seemed uncomfortable, like she wasn't quite sure what she was doing there. She'd hold the baby stiffly, not naturally. But Jonathan, Mrs. Donovan smiled at the memory. He was a natural father. He'd walk these halls with that baby, talking to her, singing sometimes. Dorothy told me once that her son had finally found real happiness after years of searching for it. I felt tears sliding down my face as I listened to this stranger describe a version of my early life I'd never known existed. A version where I was wanted, loved, treasured. They just stopped coming one day. Mrs. Donovan continued, her expression clouding. Jonathan came alone a few weeks later to tell Dorothy that Marjorie had married someone else and he'd lost custody of his daughter. Dorothy was devastated. She talked about her lost granddaughter every day until she died. She never forgave herself for not fighting harder to keep you in Jonathan's life. The use of "you" hit me like a physical blow. Mrs. Donovan had realized who I was. You're her, aren't you, the baby they used to bring? I nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Donovan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Dorothy would be so happy to know you found your way back here. She paused, thinking. There was a letter, I remember. Marjorie wrote to Dorothy explaining why she was taking you away. Dorothy kept it in her room, showed it to me once. After she died, all her personal effects went to Jonathan. But the attorney who handled her estate might have copies of everything. Would you like their contact information? I made the call that afternoon, sitting in my rental car overlooking the harbor. The attorney's office sent me a scanned copy of the letter 2 days later. I was back in Brooklyn when I opened the email, and I had to read it 3 times before the words fully registered. The letter was dated February 1989, written in my mother's handwriting. Mrs. Reed, I'm writing to tell you I've decided to marry Richard Grant and raise Nicole as his daughter. Jonathan is a good man, but he can't give her the life she deserves, the schools, the opportunities, the social position. Please don't contact us again. This is what's best for everyone. But it was the final paragraph that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped my phone. Jonathan doesn't know this, but Nicole wasn't my first pregnancy with him. I terminated the first one because I wasn't ready to leave Richard's world. I regret it now. Nicole will be the last piece of Jonathan I'll ever have, and I have to let him go. I stared at those words, understanding washing over me in cold waves. My mother had gotten pregnant with Jonathan's child before me had terminated that pregnancy to stay in her comfortable life with Richard, then gotten pregnant again. I had a sibling who never existed, a ghost sibling my father never knew about. And my mother had chosen to keep me only to take me away from the man she loved, keeping me as proof of that love while simultaneously destroying any chance we had to be a family. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. And suddenly I understood exactly why I needed to see Jonathan's lawyer in person. I was still processing the revelation about my terminated sibling when my phone rang with an unknown number. A hospital social worker introduced herself and explained that Marjorie Grant had been admitted to the cardiac unit following a minor heart attack while in custody. She was stable, but she'd been asking for me repeatedly. The prison officials had authorized a supervised visit if I consented. My immediate instinct was to refuse. I owed this woman nothing. She'd spent 36 years teaching me I was worthless, and now that she was vulnerable and alone, she wanted me to show up and provide comfort. The bitter part of me wanted to let her feel exactly what I'd felt my entire childhood, the crushing knowledge that the person you needed most didn't care enough to come. But curiosity won, or maybe it was a need for closure I couldn't quite name. I agreed to one visit, and Olivia insisted on coming with me for support. We arrived at the hospital's secure wing 2 days later, going through multiple security checkpoints, before being escorted to a private room at the end of a quiet hallway. Marjorie was handcuffed to the bedrail, a corrections officer seated in the corner. She looked nothing like the woman who'd stood at Emily's wedding reception in champagne silk, commanding a room of 200. Her face was bare of makeup, her hair showing gray at the roots, her hospital gown unflattering in the harsh fluorescent lighting. The armor of perfection had been stripped away completely, and what remained was a woman who looked old, tired, and afraid. We sat in silence for a long moment, neither of us sure how to begin. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd used during her cardiac episode. "I suppose you came to see me brought low?" I shook my head, surprising myself with the honesty of my response. "I came because I need to understand. Why me? What did I do that made you hate me so much?" Marjorie's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in my memory they looked genuine rather than performative. "You didn't do anything. That was the problem. You just existed. And every time I looked at you, I saw him, Jonathan, and I saw every choice I made wrong." She shifted against her pillows, wincing at the movement. "I chose money over love, status over happiness. I chose Richard's world over Jonathan's heart, and you were the consequence of that choice. I couldn't undo it, so I blamed you for it." The words came faster now, tumbling out in a way I'd never heard from her before. "I did love Jonathan, more than I've ever loved anyone, including Richard. But I was young and stupid and terrified of being poor. My mother raised me to believe that money was safety, that status was survival, that women like us didn't get to choose love if it came without financial security." She paused, looking at me with something that might have been shame. "When I got pregnant with you, I panicked. I almost terminated the pregnancy. I'd done it before with Jonathan's first baby, and I thought I could do it again." She saw my face change and nodded. I know you found out about that. I should have told you myself, but I've spent my life running from my own choices instead of owning them. I sat frozen listening to this confession I'd never expected to hear. I couldn't go through with terminating you, she continued. I told myself I'd marry Jonathan and make it work, that love would be enough. Then my mother showed me Richard's bank statements, his family tree, his investment portfolio. She showed me what life with money looked like versus what life without it would be. And I convinced myself I was making a practical choice for your future. I told myself you'd have a better life with Richard's wealth than Jonathan's love. You were wrong, I said quietly. I know, her voice cracked. I was so wrong. But by the time I realized it, I'd already destroyed Jonathan, already committed to the lie, already raised you to believe you were Richard's daughter. And every day you grew to look more like Jonathan, to have his expressions, his intensity. You were a walking reminder of everything I'd sacrificed for a life that made me miserable. If you knew you made the wrong choice, why did you punish me for it? I asked. Why not just try to love me? Marjorie's answer was devastating in its honesty. Because loving you meant admitting I'd thrown away my chance at real happiness. It meant facing the fact that I'd destroyed a good man for nothing, that I'd chosen wrong, and would have to live with that choice forever. It was easier to resent you than to face what I'd become. She looked directly at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, genuine remorse, not manipulative performance. I know that's not an excuse. I know I've been monstrous to you, but I need you to know it was never really about you. You were innocent. You didn't do anything wrong. I was just too broken to see past my own guilt. This was probably the closest thing to an apology I would ever receive from her. Not a full accounting of every hurt, not absolution or forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that the damage had been real and the fault had been hers. It didn't heal the wounds of 36 years, but it stopped them from festering with unanswered questions. I stood to leave feeling emotionally exhausted in a way I hadn't anticipated. As I reached the door, Marjorie called out, "Nicole, wait! The lawyer who handled Dorothy Reed's estate, Robert Brennan, he has something for you. Jonathan left it with instructions that it only be given to you if you ever came looking for the truth. He knew you would. He had faith you'd find your way to him even after he was gone." I turned back to look at her one last time. I'm going to see him tomorrow. I was already planning to. Something that might have been relief crossed her face. Good. You deserve to know everything. All of it. Not just my version of the story. I left without saying goodbye, Olivia walking silently beside me until we reached the parking lot. Only then did she speak. How do you feel? I don't know yet, I said honestly. Ask me again after I talked to Jonathan's lawyer. I took the train to Boston the next morning, watching Massachusetts countryside blur past my window while my mind raced with questions about what Jonathan's lawyer could possibly tell me that I didn't already know. Robert Brennan's office was in a historic building near the harbor, the kind of place that smelled like old books and furniture polish. He was in his 70s now, semi-retired, but his handshake was firm, and his eyes were sharp when he greeted me. "Your father was one of the most persistent clients I ever had," he said as we settled into chairs in his private office. "He never stopped believing you'd find your way to the truth. Even at the end, even when he was dying, he was making provisions for the day you'd come looking for answers." Brennan produced a wooden box from a locked cabinet sealed with wax and notarized with a date from March 2024, just weeks before Jonathan's death. He left specific instructions. If Nicole Grant ever contacts you seeking information about her birth or her biological father, give her this box. Everything inside is for her and her alone. My hands trembled as I accepted the box. It was heavier than I expected, filled with the weight of a lifetime of searching. Inside were letters Jonathan had written, but never sent photographs of us from those brief months in Maine, medical records, legal documents from his failed paternity suits, and a leather-bound journal covering 1987 to 2024. 37 years of a father's devotion to a daughter he'd been forbidden to know. I opened the journal first, drawn to Jonathan's handwriting, wanting to hear his voice through the words he'd left behind. The entries were methodical, almost obsessive in their detail. He'd documented every meeting with my mother, every conversation, every moment of their relationship, with the precision of someone who knew he might need to prove it all someday. March 1988. Marjorie told me she's pregnant. I asked her to marry me immediately. She said she needs time to think. I told her I don't care about money or status, I just want to be with her and our child. She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. May 1988. She's chosen Richard. She won't return my calls. Her mother answered once and told me never to contact them again, that Marjorie is getting married, and I need to accept that the baby isn't mine. But I know she's lying. I know that's my daughter. I don't know if I'll ever meet her. The entries continued through my childhood, documenting Jonathan's legal battles, his failed attempts to gain custody or even visitation rights, his growing desperation as year after year passed without seeing me. But there was a detail that caught my attention, something that shifted my understanding of the entire timeline. The journal showed that Jonathan and my mother had continued meeting occasionally after I was born, secret encounters that lasted until 1994. The entries were careful about this, noting when they met, but clearly indicating no intimacy after 1989. They'd seen each other, talked, maybe tried to maintain some connection to what they'd lost, but the romantic relationship had ended when she married Richard. This meant Emily, born in 1996, couldn't possibly be Jonathan's daughter. The timeline didn't support it. 7 years had passed since their last meeting, and by then Jonathan had moved to another state, trying to rebuild a life without the daughter he'd lost. I called Emily from Brennan's office, putting her on speaker with his permission. "I need you to do a DNA test," I said without preamble. "Compare your genetic markers to Ethan's. I need to confirm something." "Why?" Emily's voice was wary. "Because I need to know if you're Jonathan Reed's daughter or Richard Grant's daughter. And I think the answer matters more than you realize." The results came back 3 weeks later. Emily was not Jonathan Reed's biological child. She was Richard Grant's daughter, the only child he'd actually fathered. The news hit both of us with complicated force. For me, it was relief the specter of incest that had haunted the wedding scandal was unfounded. Ethan and Emily shared no DNA. But it also meant something darker about the family dynamics we'd grown up in. "So I was the real daughter," Emily said when I told her over the phone, her voice hollow. "I was actually his genetically, and she still destroyed me. That's almost worse, isn't it? You were rejected because you reminded her of Jonathan. But what was my excuse? I was exactly what she wanted, exactly what Richard wanted, and it still wasn't enough." I didn't have an answer for that. We were both casualties of the same war, just wounded in different ways. The most significant item in Jonathan's box was a letter dated March 2024, addressed in his careful handwriting, "To my daughter, Nicole, to be read when you find this." I read it alone in my Brooklyn apartment that night, tears streaming down my face as my father's voice reached across death to finally tell me what I'd needed to hear my entire life. "Nicole, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if Marjorie told you about me or if you've lived your whole life thinking Richard Grant was your father. But if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the truth, and that gives me hope even from beyond death. I want you to know that not a day passed that I didn't think of you. I tried everything legally possible to be in your life. I failed not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't have the resources to fight the Grant family's lawyers and money. That failure is my greatest regret." The letter continued, explaining what he understood about my mother's damage, the generational cycle of emotional abuse, the way her own mother had taught her that love was transactional and survival meant choosing money over feeling. "She didn't reject you because you were unworthy," he wrote. "She rejected you because you reminded her of the one time she chose love over money, and she couldn't forgive herself for eventually choosing money anyway. You were the evidence of her capacity for real feeling, and that terrified her. So she buried that part of herself, and buried you with it. I wish I could have protected you from that. I wish I could have been the father you deserved. But please know this, you were wanted, you were loved. And somewhere in heaven, if it exists, I'm watching you reclaim your life with immense pride. I read that paragraph 5 times, letting each word sink in, feeling something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 36 years finally begin to loosen. I was wanted. I was loved. Not by the people who raised me, but by the man who'd fought for me, who'd never stopped fighting, even when every door was slammed in his face. The final line made me laugh through my tears. P.S. I've established a secondary trust fund for you separate from your inheritance from your grandmother. $8 million held by attorney Brennan. Use it to build the life Marjorie tried to steal from you. Love, Dad. Dad. He'd signed it Dad, claiming me in death the way he'd been prevented from claiming me in life. I sat in my apartment holding that letter, feeling the weight of 2 inheritances. $15 million from my grandmother, $8 million from my father, $23 million total. That represented not just money, but love. Protection, the desire to give me freedom and security, even from beyond the grave. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be someone's daughter, not through obligation or appearance, but through genuine unconditional love. Jonathan Reed had given me that even though we'd never met, even though he'd died before I knew the truth. And that gift was worth more than any amount of money could ever measure. Attorney Brennan connected me with Jonathan's extended family within days of our meeting. His younger sister Margaret, now in her late 60s, reached out immediately with an invitation to a family gathering in Vermont. "We've been waiting 36 years to meet you," she said over the phone, her voice thick with emotion. "Please come, please. Let us show you the family your father wanted you to know." Walking into that house full of strangers who shared my DNA was surreal. I stood in the doorway of Margaret's farmhouse feeling paralyzed until she rushed forward and embraced me, crying openly. "You look so much like Jonathan. God, it's like seeing my brother young again." She held me at arm's length, studying my face. "You have his eyes, his stubborn chin, even the way you hold yourself like you're bracing for impact. He stood like that too after he lost you." Over the course of that weekend, I met cousins I'd never known existed, heard stories about a father I'd never met. Jonathan had been a software engineer before it was fashionable, brilliant with computers, and terrible at small talk. He'd loved hiking and bad science fiction movies, and made puns that were so awful they became funny. He'd been fiercely loyal to the people he loved and absolutely relentless once he decided something was important. "He never stopped looking for you," Margaret told me on the second evening, sitting on her porch overlooking mountains that were just beginning to show autumn colors. Even at the end, weeks before the accident, he was reviewing legal options, talking to new attorneys, convinced there had to be some way to reach you. My brother spent 36 years grieving a daughter he'd held for 3 months and then lost. It consumed him. She showed me photographs spanning Jonathan's entire life. Baby pictures where I could see my own infant face reflected back. Childhood photos where his serious expression matched my own. College graduation where his smile revealed the same slightly crooked front tooth I'd always been self-conscious about. Photos from his brief marriage to Ethan's mother where he looked happy but distracted, as if part of him was always somewhere else. And finally, photos from his last years where the grief had settled into the lines of his face like permanent weather. "You inherited more than his features," Margaret said, touching my hand. "You got his determination too. The fact that you found the truth, that you built a case strong enough to expose what happened, that's all Jonathan. He would be so proud of who you've become." Ethan arrived on the second day, and watching him interact with our father's family added another layer of complexity to our relationship. We'd been allies then, co-conspirators, then acknowledged half-siblings. But standing together in the context of the Reed family meeting, aunts and uncles and cousins, who claimed us both, the bond shifted into something more substantial. Later that evening, he and I walked through the property together, needing space from the overwhelming emotion of the gathering. "My mother left when I was 12. Ethan said, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. She couldn't handle how obsessed Dad was with finding you. She said living with him was like being married to a ghost. I resented that my whole childhood resented this sister I'd never met for taking my father's attention, for destroying my parents' marriage, for making my dad so sad all the time. He looked at me and his expression was complicated. But now I understand. He wasn't obsessed with an idea. He was grieving a real person he loved and lost. You weren't the problem. The people who stole you from him were. I'm sorry I didn't understand that sooner. You were a kid, I said. You couldn't have known. Maybe, but I'm not a kid now and I know now. So I'm telling you, I'm glad I found you. I'm glad we're family. Something in my chest loosened at those words. Family. Not the family I'd been raised in, but something better, chosen, acknowledged, real. Back in Brooklyn, weeks later, I faced a decision that felt simultaneously practical and profound. Should I legally change my name from Grant to Reed? It wasn't about rejecting history entirely, but about claiming my true identity. After long discussions with Olivia, Emily, and Ethan, I settled on a compromise: Nicole Grant Reed, incorporating both histories, acknowledging where I'd come from, even as I claimed where I actually belonged. The legal process took several weeks of paperwork and court filings. When I finally received my new driver's license and social security card with Reed included, I stared at them for a long time. Nicole Grant Reed. It felt like permission to be whole, to contain multitudes, to acknowledge that I was shaped by both the family that rejected me and the family that had wanted me all along. Emily kept Grant legally, and I understood why. Her truth was different from mine. Richard was her biological father, and despite everything, that connection meant something to her that it could never mean to me. With Brennan's help, I began understanding the full scope of the financial situation. $15 million from my grandmother's trust, $8 million from Jonathan's fund. Then Ethan insisted on adding $5 million from the Reed Tech inheritance, calling it restitution for the years our father had suffered and for the wedding scheme that had used us all. And finally, $2 million from the settlement after Marjorie's identity theft was prosecuted, court-ordered compensation for the fraudulent accounts she'd opened in my name. $30 million total. The number was so absurd I couldn't process it. I'd spent most of my adult life living on freelance design income, worried about rent, careful about every purchase. Now I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. The wealth felt uncomfortable, tainted by how much my family had valued money over people. But refusing it would be another form of self-punishment, letting Marjorie's twisted values dictate my choices even now. This money represented love and protection from people who'd cared about my future. Rejecting it would be rejecting them. I was still trying to figure out what to do with it all when my phone rang late one night. Emily's name appeared on the screen. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, her voice more animated than I'd heard it in months, "about what we should do with all this money and pain. We have resources now. We have a platform. People listened when you told your story. What if we used all of it, the money, the attention, the hard-won knowledge, to make sure no other kids grow up the way we did?" I sat up in bed, my mind already racing with possibilities. "What are you thinking?" "A foundation," Emily said. "Something that helps kids in dysfunctional families, that educates people about scapegoating, and family systems that provides therapy and legal resources and escape routes for people trying to break cycles of abuse. We can't fix our childhoods, Nicole. But maybe we can fix someone else's." I thought about that 10-year-old girl locked in an attic room, listening to her family laugh and celebrate below while she sat in darkness. I thought about all the other children sitting in their own versions of that room right now, believing they deserved their isolation. And I thought about having the power to tell them they didn't, to offer them the resources and support I'd never had. "Yes," I said. "Let's do it." Emily's proposal sat with me for days, growing roots in my mind, until I couldn't think about anything else. But first I had to work through my own resistance to the inheritance itself. $30 million represented everything I'd been denied. Love acceptance acknowledgement now converted into a number in a bank account. Part of me wanted to refuse it all on principle, not wanting anything connected to the pain that had shaped my life. Olivia spent an entire evening talking me through it. "This isn't blood money," she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with her lawyer voice firmly in place. "It's compensation. It's your grandmother and your father trying to give you the security they couldn't provide while they were alive. Refusing it doesn't punish anyone but yourself. The people who hurt you don't care if you take this money or not. They're facing their own consequences. This inheritance is separate from that." I knew she was right. The money was a tool, and I got to decide how to use it. Accepting it didn't mean forgiving the past or pretending the damage hadn't been real. It meant acknowledging that I deserved security and freedom, that my grandmother and father had loved me enough to provide for my future even after their deaths. The question wasn't whether to accept it, but what to build with it. Emily Ethan. Olivia and I met for a weekend brainstorming session at a rental house upstate away from the city and the constant reminders of our family drama. Emily had been thinking about this constantly since our first phone call about it, and she came prepared with research. "I've been looking at existing organizations for abuse survivors," she said, spreading printouts across the dining table. "There are good resources for people escaping physical abuse, domestic violence, that kind of thing, but there's almost nothing for people dealing with the type of abuse we experienced: emotional manipulation, family scapegoating, parental alienation, financial control. The kind of abuse that doesn't leave visible scars, but destroys you from the inside." She looked up at all of us. "What if we created a foundation specifically for people escaping toxic families? People who've been gaslit their whole lives into thinking their family is normal, and they're the problem. People who need permission to leave resources to rebuild and validation that what they experienced was real." The idea resonated immediately. We spent the next 12 hours mapping out what this could look like. Emergency financial assistance for people leaving toxic family situations who'd been cut off from resources. Therapy and counseling with specialists trained in family trauma and scapegoat dynamics. Legal support for people dealing with inheritance manipulation, identity theft by family members, or custody battles where one parent weaponizes children against the other. Educational resources teaching people to recognize covert abuse patterns that are normalized in many families. Housing assistance for those who need to relocate away from family influence. By Sunday evening, we had a framework. I committed $10 million of my personal inheritance to establish the Reed Foundation for Family Healing. Emily contributed $3 million from her settlement with the Grant estate after the annulment. Ethan added $5 million and agreed to serve on the board of directors, bringing his business expertise to ensure the foundation was sustainable long-term. We crafted a mission statement together: supporting individuals who've experienced family-based emotional abuse, scapegoating, and systemic exclusion. We believe that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave, and we're here to help people do that safely. The name honored Jonathan's memory while creating distance from the Grant legacy. We launched quietly, just a website, initial program structure, and partnerships with carefully vetted therapists and family law attorneys. I insisted on building substance before seeking publicity, not wanting this to become about my story, rather than the people we were trying to help. But as I poured energy into the foundation over the following months, I discovered that building something positive from trauma was harder than I'd anticipated. Some days I woke up energized and purposeful. Other days I couldn't get out of bed, overwhelmed by the weight of other people's stories that reminded me too much of my own. I started therapy myself, twice a week sessions with a trauma specialist who helped me recognize that I was exhibiting classic PTSD symptoms. Hypervigilance in social situations, constantly scanning for signs of rejection or criticism. Difficulty trusting people's motivations, even when they'd given me no reason for suspicion. A tendency to self-isolate when stressed, falling back into old patterns of believing I was safer alone. Panic attacks triggered by unexpected things. The scent of my mother's perfume on a stranger in an elevator. Certain critical tones of voice that reminded me of childhood. The feeling of being excluded from group conversations even when the exclusion was accidental. Recovery wasn't linear. Some weeks I made progress feeling strong and clear-headed. Other weeks I regressed falling into old patterns of self-blame and shame. I wrote in my journal during a particularly difficult week, I thought exposing the truth would fix me. But I'm learning that justice and healing are different processes. I got justice. Healing is going to take longer, and that's okay. The foundation launched officially in April, exactly 1 year after the wedding that had changed everything. We kept it deliberately low-key, working with just 5 families in the first month, learning what worked and what needed adjustment. By month 3, we were helping 15 families. By month 642. That's when the email arrived from Dr. Catherine Moore. I was working from home reviewing grant applications when her message appeared in my inbox. Ms. Reed, my name is Dr. Catherine Moore. I'm a psychologist who's been working with family trauma survivors for 20 years. I came across your foundation's website, and I'm impressed by what you're building. I'd like to discuss collaborating on something bigger, a national network of similar organizations coordinating resources and sharing best practices. This work is desperately needed, and you're positioned to help scale it. Can we meet? I read the email 3 times, my heart racing with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. A national network, scaling the foundation beyond what we'd imagined. It was exactly what we'd hoped for but hadn't dared to plan for so soon. I forwarded the email to Emily, Ethan, and Olivia with a simple message. Is this real? Are we ready for this? Emily responded within minutes. We're never going to feel ready. Let's do it anyway. I was still processing Dr. Moore's email when I received word through Marjorie's attorney that my mother wanted to see me before sentencing. She'd taken a plea deal, 6 years in federal prison for wire fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft with parole possible after 4 years. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and I'd been agonizing over whether to attend or submit a written victim impact statement from a safe distance. Before I could decide, I agreed to one final visit. This time I went alone, telling no one, not Olivia, not Emily, not Ethan. This needed to be just me and the woman who'd given birth to me, but never truly mothered me, facing each other without witnesses or buffers. The pre-sentencing detention facility was exactly as depressing as I'd imagined. Everything smelled of industrial cleaner layered over human desperation. The walls were beige, the lighting fluorescent, and unforgiving, the furniture bolted to floors. I was led through multiple security checkpoints before being brought to a visitation room divided by glass panels, the kind you see in movies where conversations happen through phone receivers. Marjorie appeared in an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight, her hair had gone fully gray without professional coloring, her face was bare of the makeup that had always been part of her armor. She'd aged a decade in the year since her arrest. We sat across from each other, picking up the phone receivers simultaneously, and for a long time neither of us spoke. I studied her face, looking for something, recognition, remorse, the mother I'd needed and never had. Finally, she broke the silence. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve it, and I'm not sure I'd believe myself if I asked. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say, and somehow that honesty made the moment more painful rather than less. I didn't come here to give you anything, I said. I came to see if there was anything real between us worth saving. Marjorie nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. I don't think there is. I destroyed it before it could grow, before you could even remember it existing. We talked for over an hour, and for the first time in my memory, it felt like an actual conversation rather than a performance. She admitted she'd known Richard wasn't a good father, but never intervened because his coldness toward me meant she didn't have to acknowledge her own rejection. She told me Emily had been conceived through IVF specifically to give Richard an heir he could fully claim and attempt to make up for the child that wasn't genetically his. The consulting business started as legitimate matchmaking, she said, her voice hollow. I was good at reading people, at knowing which families would mesh well together. But then I realized how much power I could hold over wealthy families desperate to maintain status, how much they'd pay to avoid scandal or secure advantageous marriages. And I stopped seeing people as people. They became assets, transactions, problems to be solved. She looked down at her hands, the perfectly manicured nails I remembered now ragged and unpolished. I became exactly what my mother raised me to be, a woman who sees people as assets, love, as currency relationships, as strategic alliances. And by the time I realized what I'd become, it felt too late to change. So I just kept going, getting worse, until there was nothing human left. I asked the question that had haunted me since childhood, the one I'd been too afraid to voice until now. Did you ever actually love me, even for a moment? Marjorie's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, tracking down her bare face. Yes, when you were born. For about 6 months. You were perfect and innocent, and I loved you so much it terrified me. I'd look at you and feel this overwhelming tenderness I'd never experienced before. It was frightening how vulnerable that love made me feel. She wiped at her face with the sleeve of her jumpsuit. Then Jonathan started his legal fight, hiring lawyers and filing motions, and threatening to expose everything. And I had to choose admit the truth and lose everything I'd built with Richard, or bury my feelings for you and keep my life. I chose my life. I chose status and money and appearance over you. And I've regretted it every day since, even as I kept making the same choice over and over again. Before I left, I pulled out one of the photographs she'd sent me months ago, the one showing her holding baby Nicole on the beach in Maine, both of us bathed in golden light, her face showing genuine tenderness I'd never seen in person. I slid it through the small slot at the bottom of the glass partition. You should have this, I said. It's proof that you were capable of love once. Maybe it'll help you remember you're human even if you forgot how to act like it. Marjorie took the photograph with trembling hands, staring at her younger self as if looking at a stranger from another lifetime. Who is that woman? She whispered. I don't even recognize her anymore. I stood to leave, signaling to the guard that I was ready to go. At the door, I turned back one last time. I don't forgive you, but I release you. You don't have power over my life anymore. You're just a sad woman in a cage you built yourself, and I'm walking away free. Marjorie nodded, still holding the photograph, tears streaming down her face. Goodbye, Nicole. I really am sorry. I know, I said, and I meant it. I did believe she was sorry in whatever broken way she was capable of feeling sorry. It just didn't change anything. I walked out without looking back through the security checkpoints and into the parking lot where late afternoon sun felt like a benediction. I sat in my car for a long time, crying not from sadness exactly, but from the finality of it all. That chapter of my life was closed. Whatever small hope I'd carried that my mother might somehow become the parent I needed had died in that sterile visitation room. I was halfway home when my phone rang, an unknown number with a DC area code. This is the sentencing coordinator for the U.S. District Court, a professional female voice said. We have a problem. Someone has submitted a victim impact statement in favor of leniency for Marjorie Grant signed with your name. We need to verify this is legitimate before the hearing. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't submit any statement. Someone forged my signature. That's what we need to determine. Can you come to the courthouse tomorrow to provide verification and possibly file a fraud report? I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind racing. Someone had forged a statement in my name asking for leniency for my mother. The question was who and why. I went to the courthouse the next day and clarified immediately that I'd never submitted any leniency request. The forged statement was traced back to one of Marjorie's former social circle friends, someone who apparently believed I owed my mother forgiveness, regardless of what she'd done. Instead, I submitted my own victim impact statement, which I chose to read aloud at the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later. Standing at the podium in that federal courtroom looking at the judge while feeling Marjorie's eyes on me from the defendant's table, I spoke with a clarity I'd spent 36 years learning to find. Marjorie Grant systematically destroyed my childhood, my sense of self, and my ability to trust. She used me as a scapegoat for her own guilt, and as a pawn in her financial schemes. I don't wish her harm, but I do believe she should face the full consequences of her actions. Not as punishment, but as accountability, something she's never experienced before. perhaps in prison without the armor of wealth and status, she'll finally have to confront who she really is. The judge sentenced her to the full 6 years without early parole eligibility, citing a pattern of calculated manipulation spanning decades. Richard attended the hearing, but sat in the back row and didn't speak. Afterward, as people filed out, I saw him standing alone near the exit. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something that might have been regret or shame or simply exhaustion. I walked past him without stopping. That was the last time I ever saw him. 3 years passed like water flowing around stones, reshaping the landscape slowly but undeniably. The Reed Foundation grew from our initial small operation into a national network with chapters in 15 states. We'd helped 3,847 individuals leave toxic family situations, provided over $12 million in direct financial assistance-funded therapy for 2,200 people, and won 37 legal cases involving family-based identity theft or financial abuse. I served as executive director, working alongside Dr. Catherine Moore, who'd become our clinical director and one of my closest friends. Emily ran the housing program with the passionate intensity of someone determined to give others what she'd needed and never received. Ethan provided technological infrastructure and major funding, treating the foundation as his way of honoring Jonathan's memory and making peace with the years his father had spent grieving. The TED Talk invitation came in late 2027, scheduled for February 2028, exactly 4 years after the wedding that had changed everything. I was terrified. Public speaking had never been comfortable, and the idea of standing on that iconic red circle in front of cameras broadcasting to millions made my stomach clench with anxiety. But I recognized the platform's reach, the opportunity to help people I'd never meet face to face. I titled the talk, "The Inheritance of Silence: Breaking Generational Cycles of Family Trauma." And I practiced it dozens of times until the words felt natural rather than rehearsed. When the day came, standing under those lights with an audience of strangers watching, I told my story not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a survivor offering insight. For 36 years, I believed the lie that I was the problem. I said my voice steadier than I'd expected. I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult. It took my family collapsing publicly for me to realize the truth. I wasn't too much. They were too little, too afraid, too damaged, too committed to appearances to see the human being in front of them. And once I understood that, I stopped trying to earn love from people who decided I was unworthy. I started building a life where love wasn't something you earned, it was something you gave and received freely. The talk went viral within days, reaching 18 million views in the first month. My inbox flooded with messages I couldn't possibly answer personally, but one letter stood out enough that I framed it in my office. It was from a woman named Margaret, 58 years old, who wrote, "I've spent my entire life trying to understand why my mother hates me, why nothing I do is good enough. Your talk helped me see it's not about me, it's about her. I'm 58 years old and finally giving myself permission to stop trying to fix it. Because of your story, I'm finally leaving. I'm going to live the last third of my life for myself." That letter reminded me why the work mattered, why sharing my story publicly had been worth the discomfort. I wasn't just helping people my age. I was helping people who'd spent entire lifetimes trapped in dynamics they couldn't name, giving them permission to recognize they weren't crazy, they were abused. And it was never too late to choose yourself. 6 months after the TED Talk, I received a call from the prison. Marjorie had died of a heart attack, sudden and unexpected, never fully serving her sentence. The news landed strangely, not the relief or grief I might have predicted, but something more complex. A closing of a chapter I'd already moved past. Emily, Ethan, and I decided to scatter her ashes together on the main beach, where Jonathan had once brought baby Nicole, the same beach from those old photographs. We stood on cold sand in February wind, the Atlantic crashing behind us with dramatic force. Emily held the simple wooden box, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "Relief, grief, guilt for feeling relieved." "All of it," I said. "It's okay to feel all of it." Ethan spoke quietly. My father spent his life being destroyed by her. I spent years trying to expose her. But standing here now, I mostly feel sad. Sad for what could have been if she'd chosen differently. I added my own truth. She could have been happy. She could have loved and been loved. But she was too scared, and that fear poisoned everything it touched, including us. But we survived her. And that's what matters. Together we opened the box and released the ashes into the wind. They scattered across beach and water, disappearing into the landscape that had witnessed both the beginning and ending of this story. I watched them go and felt something inside me release as well, not forgiveness, but a letting go of weight I'd carried too long. Emily spoke first, to the end of secrets. Ethan, to the family we chose. Me, to the freedom we earned. As we walked back toward our cars, I looked back once at the water where my mother had disappeared into the elements. I whispered words only I could hear. I hope you find peace wherever you are. I finally have. And that's the story of Nicole Grant Reed, the woman who transformed exclusion into liberation silence, into voice and pain into purpose. This isn't just a story about a wedding or a family scandal. It's about the journey of reclaiming yourself after 36 years of being erased. Nicole proved that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who never learned how to love you properly. She didn't just survive her family, she outlived their cruelty, built a legacy that has helped thousands of others find their way out of similar situations, and showed the world that being excluded from the table doesn't mean you're worthless. It means the table was never worthy of you in the first place. 5 years after scattering her mother's ashes, Nicole is now 47, teaching workshops on family trauma, and the Reed Foundation has helped over 25,000 people nationwide. Her book, The Daughter Who Wasn't Invited, has become a case study in psychology programs about family scapegoat dynamics. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in Nicole's story, if you've ever felt like the family scapegoat, like the one who's never good enough, no matter how hard you try, then know this: you're not crazy and you're not alone. Millions of people are living through similar experiences, and just like Nicole, you deserve a life that isn't defined by other people's rejection. Please subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories about survival, healing, and reclaiming power. Hit the like button if this story touched your heart, and most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you see yourself in Nicole's story? Have you ever been the victim of family favoritism or scapegoating? How did you find the strength to walk away from toxic relationships? Our community is here to listen, support, and share. Sometimes just knowing that others understand you is enough to start the healing journey. Thank you for staying until the very end, and remember, you deserve unconditional love, not because you're perfect, but because you're human. See you in the next video.